I'm going to share this story to the best of my recollection. This happened to me back in late 1991 or early 1992, at the tender age of 17. At that point, I was working for a company that provided contracted security services on an as-needed basis to several companies operating around and on the Navajo reservation. The contract I worked under required me to travel between locations. They were located within 2 regions of the reservation themselves. This meant that I spent about 75% of my time traveling either north to south or out of Window Rock, Arizona. At night, after stopping at one destination and securing it with another security officer who'd arrived there around midnight, I would head north toward Peach Springs, Arizona, where my next stop was located right near Grand Canyon Caverns. As I left the vicinity of the Grand Canyon Caverns parking lot, I'd make my way a right onto Arizona Highway 64, heading east toward Belmont. There are only 3 things worth mentioning in regards to my drive from Peach Springs to Belmont. First, there's a spot on the road where it curves slightly, and there used to be a sign indicating road conditions ahead. As I recall, that sign said either conditions not verified or conditions worsen as you go. Something like that. That's just how isolated these locations were. There was no radio station providing news updates along the way, and cell service was practically non-existent, except for sporadic coverage near larger towers, such as Tuba City and Kayenta, places we stopped at during our shift changes. 8 hours on, 8 hours off. Secondly, for most of my drive, I'd usually see and or hear herds of wild horses running off in the distance. And thirdly, there was always an area with a dense canopy directly to my left, outside of which it seemed like pitch black. But suddenly, in the middle of this darkness, I saw something big, dark, and moving. Something that didn't look human or animal. It looked like a weird entity. From all the accounts, including those from other security officers who were also assigned to this region, as well as those interviewed by law enforcement officials, it appeared as though those who encountered this being described seeing either a hairy man or an animal-like being covered in hair. 2 security officers who encountered it said they saw one thing, while a third described seeing something else entirely. Compare that to the other reports, many of which indicate that witnesses describe seeing either a humanoid or what appears to be some type of beast. I've seen both too, and this wasn't either. The situation at hand began with me driving all along Highway 64 through an area where there was no light, except for maybe my headlights, and suddenly coming upon this bizarre dark anomaly directly ahead of me, seemingly moving toward the road as if crossing over to my side. As I watched it move toward me, I remember thinking, "What is that?" And the closer it got to me, the more its shape became clear, although it still didn't look like a man or an animal. In fact, I'd never seen anything look like it before in my life. And yes, I thought the creature from the Black Lagoon looked immediately like this, because there was something fish-like about its movements. It had this dark grayish feature, wet leathery looking skin, or so the texture reminded me of. There were no distinguishing features except for what appeared to be eyes, pupilless, solid white orbs that looked more reflective than they did expressive. Its arms were longer than any human arms I'd ever seen, and they seemed to reach past down its knees. Its legs appeared deformed, muscular thighs on skinny calves, and very oddly proportioned, not quite like those of a man nor an ape, but a weird combination of the two, not to mention its strange creature-like appearance. And the head, it was bulbous and had this long snout. It kind of reminded me of some sort of sea creature, but it was very human-like or ape-like. I understand that's a strange description, but I've never seen something like this, and I don't know how to put it to words. I could tell you, though, the ears were small and lay flat against the side of its head. Definitely not like an ape, nor any other animal I'd seen. Then suddenly, from behind me, another vehicle's headlights illuminated the creature's face. The angle was caught that such it only gave me a glimpse, and in the light, I saw something that startled me even more than the appearance of this being. This thing had fangs, just like you see in the movies or TV shows about vampires. That's what it reminded me of. 2 long, exaggerated fangs, or canines, coming down over its bottom lip. Goosebumps would cover my entire body. I was terrified. Whether it could see me or not, I don't know. But this thing's eyes were fixed on me the entire time, while its mouth hung open slightly, showing off those front teeth. Did I mention that this thing happened and moved very fast? Well, about 15 minutes after leaving Page, en route to Tuba City, along Highway 160, where there's nothing between Page and Tuba, except for the massive Navajo reservation. It was also then that I saw something big, dark, and moving through the darkness outside of my passenger window to the west side of the road. But this thing looked way different than the other creature. This looked more like a man running on his bare feet in the darkness, its arms swaying in this strange motion. This one appeared like it had long hair, but that's all that was really visible, even through the darkness. And this creature stops right in the middle of the lane of the road and turns its head to look directly at me. My stomach turned inside out the second this thing and I made eye contact. I will never forget the look of this thing staring back at me through the window, no more than 10 feet away on this isolated stretch of Highway 160. It's like it was trying to scare me and gauge my reaction to see what I was going to do. The entire experience just felt so surreal, like I was outside of my body, watching all this happen, taking place in front of me. And just before I was about to hit it, it darted across the road, disappearing into the night and the darkness. All this happened within a matter of seconds, but it felt like time had slowed down to a complete stop. After I drove on by, it felt like my entire body came back under control, so I drove a couple more miles before pulling out onto the shoulder, being completely paranoid this thing was going to follow me. I felt sick, almost nauseated, and I sat there in the dark with my car idling for a good 5-10 minutes, just trying to catch my breath and let all this sink in. I wasn't completely sure what I had witnessed for both of these beings, but they were definitely not people, at least not normal ones. Both of them ran on 2 legs, and something about their movement through the darkness made me think they were out there at night with a purpose, trying to get somewhere, God knows where. None of it really makes sense. And for weeks after this massive encounter, I had been racked with doubt about ever wanting to tell anybody, because surely they would think I was mad or just plain old crazy. But for some reason, I feel the need to talk about it. So here I am today, telling you all about what happened to me on August 5th, 2002, right around midnight, along Highway 160, as well as the other creature that I'd witnessed. The only thing relating to this story that I'm aware of is I personally know several people who live up very close to this area, and they too have heard strange stories about seeing things that just don't add up. I'll never forget that night, and I'm sure whatever was out there knows exactly who I am and when it's going to strike next. I was just leaving my girlfriend's house. This was right before the pandemic. I was driving in her neighborhood, and I saw something white in the middle of the street. It appeared to be like a dog or a wolf, but it was way bigger than anything I've seen. I gave it some gas because, obviously, I was hoping it would move out of my way. But instead, it looks up right at me, and I could see its black, beady eyes. It did not move an inch. It did not prove to be fearful of an oncoming vehicle. I actually had just gotten through reading Skinwalker Ranch by George Knapp and Colmay Keller. There's no way that that's what was going though, because they said that these things could shapeshift. The thing had pointy ears all over its head, and it was shaped more like a wolf than anything else. And to top it off, This thing ran much faster than any wolf does. Let's not forget about the fact that it stood up on 2 legs. I'm scared now, even just remembering back to this. It was huge, taller than the top of my car, and its eyes were sunken in deep into its skull, kind of like skeletal looking, and its skin looked rotted, like it had come from a graveyard or something. As I said, this was not normal looking at all, and there's no way this thing should exist and be alive. Nothing that human-like should be built like that either. It was just creepy as hell to stare into for those few seconds. The only thing that instantly came to my mind was the encounters I've heard of Mothman. But Mothman isn't even around here. And Mothman is something entirely different. But I guess it's that level of fear, that you're dealing with something evil and of the unknown. But this thing did not move out of the way entirely. It moved just over enough to where my car could get by, and then it stood there right off the side of the road, staring at me as I drove by, watching me. And even as I looked back in my rearview mirror, I could catch it, never breaking its eye contact with my vehicle, even as I went forward in the distance. It's like this thing wanted me to know it was looking at me, studying me, the way a predator studies its prey, strategizing, getting ready to strike at the right moment. I won't hesitate and say that I slammed on the gas pedal the second I drove after this thing, definitely breaking the speed limit. I took off out of there as fast as my little Honda could take me. This thing that I saw is clearly not living by any means we know about on Earth. It just broke the laws of physics and any law we have. I can only guess this is a shapeshifter of some kind, or maybe a Skinwalker. I have never dealt with something like this before, so if you could send help or send supplies, advice, anything is welcome. I was driving home late at night in a very rural area just north of El Paso, Texas, when I saw it. It appeared to be in the road in front of me, so naturally I would stop my car and try to slow down for a closer look. I don't know what it was, but I can tell you now, this thing wasn't human. It appeared to have greenish skin with scales, and it didn't take notice to me right away. Instead, just casually walking on by into the desert brush towards El Paso Hill Country Park. As soon as it disappeared in the brush, I floored it, driving away quickly. I always carry a gun on me just in case something like this ever happens, and I pray that I never have to use it. I'm also very thankful it never turned around and tried to come after me. I'm not completely sure what it was, but I don't think, at least speculate, this could be any sort of normal animal. Do I think it was a Skinwalker? I don't know. It did kind of look cartoonish though, in proportion. As terrifying as it was, I almost wonder just what kind of being this could have actually been. So I have no idea really. What I can tell you is that I know this was not a dog. If it was, it would have looked way different, and plus, dogs don't walk around on their hind legs. Not like this did. For the record, my name is Robert, and I have no reason or way to make this up. Just sending this in anonymously, for your record and anybody else you want to tell this to. My husband just got home from working a late night shift. He pulls up to the house and says, "There's somebody walking around in the backyard. I need to grab my gun." My husband reviews the security footage on his phone, and you could see that there's a very tall, stick-like thin figure with long, lanky-looking arms, slowly strolling through the back side of the yard. But its head seemed to be even with it, as it kind of glided, almost hovered above the ground. It was just staring straight ahead of itself. It looked very odd, and it kind of reminded me of like a stick figure man, but covered in animal skins, if that makes sense. From the way the footage looked, it was really hard to make out exactly what we were looking at. It didn't really make any sense, but my husband assured that he's seen it. We're both very shaken up by this sighting, and my husband believes that this is a Skinwalker. Again, as stated, This was an unknown tall, thin figure, long arms and legs, kind of hovering or gliding, strolling through the backyard. It appeared to have no concern for being seen, as it seemed to kind of stare straight ahead. Later on, my husband and I were both very shaken up by what we had seen from the footage. There is also significance in saying that this occurred on the reservation, where apparently Skinwalker sightings are often sighted, near or even within tribal lands. This would, however, make sense, due to ancient Navajo folklore involving Skinwalkers. But the figure was in no way seen in close proximity or in contact with other lives or entities. What do you think? Please let me know in the comment below if you have something to add. An opinion on the sighting or possible explanations that could help identify would definitely help us out. We'll be sure and try to respond to your comment. Thank you to anybody who reads this. Keep your eyes open for more possible encounters. God bless. The desert is a very strange place during the nighttime. You can't always tell if what you're seeing is real or not. But something set me to walk out of my car and follow it. Like I was in a trance or the strange energy pulled me. I've seen a lot of crazy things in my lifetime, traveling to different states and stuff. But nothing would prepare me for what I saw, especially since it was right next to the interstate. At the time, I was traveling from Northern California down through south in Arizona. I had to stop at one point for gas, and I needed some rest as well. The trip was pretty long and very tiresome. I got myself a coffee and was about to get back on the road when this lanky white figure caught my eye. It appeared to have no hair on its body and looked like something like a deformed lizard with a long tail. Like if you crossed some sort of, maybe a sloth with a lizard. It was very strange looking, whatever it was. I don't know why I didn't react initially, but maybe I'm bad with confrontations or making up strategies on the spot in my mind. So instead of doing something that could have probably saved me from whatever it was going to do next, I just stood there, watching it move towards the desert. At the time of seeing this, I felt very confused and also frightened, even though I didn't sense an immediate threat for my well-being. So, without thinking twice about what I was going to do, I found myself on the other side of my car, heading towards where it just disappeared into the night. I thought, or maybe I didn't think, but I was convinced that if I followed it, maybe I can find out what it was. And of course, I realized pretty quickly how stupid this was on my part, because before I could even go after it, this thing jumps out right in front of me, as if it knew I was going to follow its tracks. And believe me, it did not want to be followed. It jumps in front of me and stands up straight, but because it was still concealed in the darkness of the night, I couldn't get a very good look at its face, but I could see these two eyes glowing red, and it stepped toward me, where I could get a face reveal a little bit better. Its face alone made my blood run cold. It didn't appear to have a nose or ears at all, just two slits where its nose should have been. Like this creature had some sort of strange genetic disorder. It looked malformed and misshapen. Its face kind of reminded me of what a burn victim looks like, but even worse, far more demonic and sinister looking. It exposed its teeth by opening its mouth, by kind of grinning at me, and its teeth looked more like a shark's teeth, and it just slowly moved its way towards me. Now, I was frozen in fear. I could not move my body. All I could do was just sit there and watch this thing approach me. Had I not done what I was about to do, I probably would have been dead. This thing begins to reach out to grab me. But before it can do that, the only thing I can think to do in my mind is to start praying, and praying out loud. The second I do, this thing stops and gives me this expression like, "What are you doing?" And its expression changes from a grin to horrified, and begins to quickly retreat into the darkness. This, of course, was not instantaneous, maybe over the course of 10 or 20 seconds. Of course, my concept of time is probably off, but it was not instant. Whatever I did or said It made me make it realize that maybe eating me right then and there wasn't probably the best idea, and it ran back, disappearing into the night of the desert. I pulled myself up pretty quickly, and I felt like I had broken out of its trance. I just want to say something real quick. You might hear my story and think, oh, it's just another stupid, scary story, or maybe some cheap creepypasta written by a 15-year-old wannabe. But I'm telling you, the second I laid eyes on this thing, even though I was frightened, I feel like it put some sort of spell on me. Like everything in my being was compelled to follow it into the night. Even though common sense would tell you that is a bad idea. But I wasn't being controlled by common sense or fear. It's like something had lured me out of my car and told me, yes, go follow it, follow it, follow it, follow it. It's like an instinct. And in that moment, everything made sense to try and follow this thing. The same driving instinct you get when you're starving and need to eat, or you need to sleep, or procreate. That's the only way how I know how to describe the emotion, feeling, and the mentality behind it. But as soon as I prayed and this thing left, it's like that spell it had over me was completely broken. Of course, I've never really heard of stories like this happening before, but I'm here to tell you mine, and this is generally what happened. After this, I decided to head straight for a hotel where I can try and rest my head and get myself together. So pretty much, this was my encounter with what I believe to be a Skinwalker, or something of the demonic realm. Despite all the rumors about these things being out there or not being out there, I can tell you that when you're confronted by something like this, it changes the way you think. It makes you realize there's probably definitely Skinwalkers out here, and that they are far more dangerous than you realize. Since they are initially practicers of black magic, them casting some sort of spell on you to make them follow you, I guess does make sense. I'm just trying to rationalize what happened in my encounter, but I would love feedback. My advice is to do whatever you can to ward these things off. This is a story I'm going to share with you that was actually shared with me by my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather grew up in the Choctaw tribe, and he always told me about a man in the village who practiced black magic. This man was actually exiled from the village for being caught with his practices, but swore up and down to the entire village and warned everybody he would come back and haunt the village, in life and in death, and he has kept his promise. The man was not only a practitioner of black magic, but also a skinwalker, a shapeshifter, a being, a servant of the night. He would come back and kidnap children, kidnap some of the village's women. He would hex and curse several members of the tribe, even with one of the elders suddenly developing a sudden illness that killed him within days. After a short amount of time, a small group of warriors set out to hunt this skinwalker or man down, having a pretty good idea of exactly where he was at. The story goes that when these 4 soldiers, or Choctaw warriors, found the skinwalker, he shapeshifted into a massive wolf creature, devouring, mauling, and tearing apart 2 of the warriors right then and there. The other 2 warriors tried to fight him off, but he ended up killing one, while the other retreated for their lives. The last warrior made it back to the tribe and warned everybody about what happened and the dangers of this man. He too, within a couple weeks' time, would come down with a sudden illness that would kill him within a matter of days. It was then speculated that the winter killed the skinwalker, that it was too brutally cold and that the man had froze to death. However, his spirit had returned to curse the village even further. And it wasn't until years later, when my great-grandfather was a young man, that a medicine man of the village had put up wards all over to finally protect the village and keep this evil skinwalker spirit's energy away, which seemed to work for some time. However, it seemed like after that, the skinwalker spirit's energy just became more and more diffused. Bad things still happened. They all believed that more and more people were hexed. But as time went on, it became much less noticeable, and life became much more manageable as the years would go on. and everybody would forget about this Skinwalker. I would just like to say that this was shared with me by my great-grandfather long before he passed. He died at the age of 101. He was a very healthy, very sharp old man. And I always found this story to be very intriguing, because it was right around the same time that I developed a deep interest in learning about Skinwalkers. I hope you enjoyed his story, and you are more than welcome to share this with your audience. Peace be with you. To my knowledge, this is not happening anymore, but a few years ago, about 5 or so of these beings were very active. I believe it started with either animals being found dead or just missing. Then people who were found camping in the woods also had gone missing. My grandparents' home was built on top of an old Indian cemetery, which is why I think this was happening at their house. The energy around there was different. The spirits were very active. Every night around midnight, you could hear banging on the inside of the walls in the house, footsteps running back and forth outside, heavy breathing outside the front door and windows. The activity, though, seemed to calm down finally, right around evening, where it would pick up again at night. One day, my uncle comes home, and we're all very excited to see him. All of us kids celebrate by going to play hide-and-go-seek in the backyard, out by these huge willow trees. They are probably well over 300 years old. As soon as everybody had found a spot to hide, the first person counting saw movement out of the corners of their eyes, turning around fast, expecting to find someone or something there, but nothing close. At that exact moment, every single willow tree seemed to light up bright as day with this bluish hue, and just going dark again. It probably lasted only a few seconds, but feeling like an eternity. Just then, my older cousin, who was in charge of counting, yells out, "Stop, stop!" And everybody comes running back over to where my uncle is, and they've all got this terrified look on their face. My aunt gets extremely upset, starts demanding an explanation. They tell her that what they saw over by the trees, and she looks at them as if they're crazy. But the uncle and all the kids playing swear up and down they saw something that looked like a man, but was not, watching them through the trees. That whatever it was covered in animal skins and had large black eyes. Apparently, from what we heard, it turned around and walked into this bright blue thing of light, or what we speculate was a portal, which would make sense why all the trees around it illuminated a bright blue, and then disappeared. The portal theory was what my uncle suggested, judging by the lighting and seeing what it walked into, how it kind of just turned around and disappeared with the light. My aunt, of course, did not believe us, but saw the light as well. She tried to brush it off as well, as if they're just imagining it, and in the end says that, well, we should probably try to come up with a better story and figure something else out. My opinion on it is that there's definitely spirits here, and I wouldn't be surprised if we truly saw some sort of being from another world come in through a portal right where those willow trees are. I will say this, though. That area where it disappeared in, by those really old willow trees, things feel very strange over there. Like when you go over there, it just feels colder and like you're always constantly being watched. It's a feeling it's hard to describe, but it just makes you feel uneasy. There's a reason we never really play over there. It just doesn't feel right. I was at my old apartment in Denver, Colorado, when I had a chance to see this very large, hairy wolf-like creature standing upright before disappearing into a thicket. It was very gray and dark, very smoky color. At the time, I was outside smoking a cigarette, and it was pretty early in the morning, before I had to go off to work. And I see it there off in the distance, trying to formulate in my brain what I'm looking at. And it stares at me, and I see its red glowing eyes before it turns and disappears. I'm obviously in shock and disbelief, thinking it was maybe a coyote, but it did not run off like one, or any normal animal for that matter. One thing I can remember, though, is shortly after seeing it, even despite I was smoking a cigarette, because we all know how stinky cigarettes are. I just smelled this overwhelming odor of sulfur. It lingered worse than cigarette smell does. I'm very knowledgeable on the fact that skinwalkers exist, and I know what they are, so that's the only logical explanation. But beyond that, I'm not very knowledgeable about Native American mythology, so I'm hoping somebody can find some answers here for me. But I know nothing other than the native culture in Colorado, or the surrounding states, although I'm sure they have their folklore and legends as well. I would also like to add that it took a good moment or two to get my head together and really comprehend what I was seeing. It did not appear to be moving or get down on all fours at any given time throughout this sighting. It actually moved very comfortably from what I saw on two legs, even had hocks like a dog, but appeared to move very humanoid or very much like a man. Judging by the way it looked, I don't even know if it ever got down on all four, so I've been trying to do some research, and I can't find a lot of stories about skinwalkers to try and compare what I saw. The town where this happens also is not very populated either, so I would imagine maybe this skinwalker was just coming through the area, or what. Maybe there are hundreds lurking around every corner. I'm not exactly sure. I can also promise you that even though this was in the early morning, I was fully awake. I was not intoxicated. I had not taken any substance or drugs. Well, besides a cigarette and nicotine. But nicotine isn't going to make you see this. This was not yet a bad dream or a nightmare. I believe this is an evil spirit or a spirit creature that can interact with the physical world, aka a skinwalker. The one thing that I am aware of, though, is that this area as a whole has a lot of UFO sightings. I don't know if that has anything to do with what I saw that night, but it's interesting. I've seen quite a few myself. While I can't speak on behalf of aliens or little green men, there have been a lot of strange lights and things seen in the sky, but not just me, but many people in town, many friends, family, and accomplices that I personally know of and talk to. I guess I'll just have to keep searching for answers. Otherwise, I'll just have to chalk this up to another one of life's many mysteries. But I'm pretty sure that what I saw was real, and not just something I hallucinated. Although the whole thing lasted for less than 10 seconds, it was enough to stick with me for a lifetime. A few years back, my buddies and I decided to take a ride out to Las Vegas to see the world-famous UFO crash site. You know, Roswell. The drive out there was really cool. It's a long stretch of road between Roswell and Las Vegas. You can see for miles in either direction, so for about 20 minutes down the road, we saw a dog laying by the side of the road, as dead as a doornail. We joked around how maybe it was a feral dog or something killed by one of those black panthers that they supposedly have out here in the desert. Whatever it wasn't normal. I don't know what kind of animal has grayish-black fur all over its body. That was as large as this thing was, but it was of considerable size. Anyhow, we parked right outside the UFO crash site, which is basically just piles of dirt with some junk thrown around, from what I can remember. There really wasn't much to see. So we decided to get out and stretch our legs, when this guy comes up to us and he's acting all frantic, telling us not to move until we figure out which way we're facing. He says we need to be careful and make sure we're not facing north, so as to not end up in Canada, or worse. We were like, is this guy on drugs? What on earth? The guy was out of his mind and started saying some gibberish about skinwalkers or something. Then he went to talk about how he was possessed and how he had seen the devil, and then kind of ran off and ranting and gibbering under his breath. We're kind of creeped out by him, by how weird he is and how he seems so out of his mind. So as we're leaving, getting in our car and pulling away, he stops us again and begins to act somewhat sane by telling my friend who's driving that he needs to hear this. We're trying to interrupt him and cut through the conversation, telling him, look, dude, you're clearly crazy, we don't want to hear it. And he starts going off on a rant over my friend about apparently reptilian shapeshifters are all around us, and we need to leave now. Go back the way we came, it's not safe. And while he seemed completely out of his mind and crazy, there was just something incredibly creepy about his demeanor. Like there's just some people that you meet and talk to, you just get a very bad feeling from. Not that he was bad, but he just gave off vibes that weren't really good. They were so uncomfortable that we had to get out of there. I understand that this isn't necessarily a sighting or an encounter, but it certainly made all of us very uncomfortable. You might have heard of the Kushtaka. They are the Alaskan equivalent of a Skinwalker, but up here, they go by a different name. They are still just as terrifying and haunting. I've had my fair share of run-ins with them, but this one is always stuck in my head. My best friend and I were up in Juneau on a 4-wheel drive trip, and we stopped by a lake to take some pictures. We spent an hour or two just relaxing at the lakeside before finally heading back into our little blue truck to drive down the road. It was now getting dark out, so I turned on my dome light, getting ready for us to set off again. And I noticed something moving out of the corner of my eyes while looking over towards Kaylin, my friend who was sitting in her seat, looking like she was fumbling around for something with her door. It covered half her view, completely blocking what it is that she was doing from my line of sight. I sat there for a second and watched as the corner of my eye caught something again. More movement. This time, however, it made no sound at all, even though I could feel that it had shifted its weight over onto the edge that was facing me. Whatever it was stood there, watching us, waiting for what we were going to do next. Instinctually, I thought this to be a bear, but after sitting in silence for a few seconds, I could tell that neither the animal or I would have been so perfectly still, nor did either animal's fur ever stick up like it. It had short, spiky hair running down from its neck, all the way down its spine, and it looked very unnatural. It stepped outside enough to make itself known. It had been concealed by the trees and the shadows, but made itself known like it wanted us to see it. It was almost kind of a sadistic intention, like it wanted to show itself to us to scare us. And when the headlights illuminated this being for the first time, Kaylin was still fumbling around with something, and this being let out a low growl, slowly baring its teeth before shifting its weight onto the other foot to take off running right towards our truck. I screamed at Kaylin that we needed to go right now. I drove head-on at this thing, and it dove right out of the way to the left before I could hit it. We did a Hollywood-style 180, as Kaylin and I are screaming, and this thing is nowhere in sight. But now we could hear it growling, and it sounded very close by. So I floored it out of there, and it did not take us long to get back on the road. But instead of heading out of town, we went straight for my grandparents' house, where we could make it out with having to go through any intersections that were a lot of people around, if that did happen. Luckily for us, nothing followed us, at least not that we saw or heard anyway. What really made this whole thing terrifying was how it stood still and watched us for a while before it ever showed its presence to us. It's like it had been observing us, watching us, wondering what we would do. And then at the right moment, it's like it wanted us to see that it was there, to know that, hey, I'm here, and I'm gonna scare you. That has always stuck with me through all the years. I never understood why an animal would do that. It's so unnatural. The only time you would ever have something remotely close to that is if the prey was cornered and could not run. What's even worse is Kaylin could not find her phone, and she believes that she left it back at the lake where we were at. I told her we'd have to wait till tomorrow during the daylight to go back, which we did do, and it had a very eerie presence, like this thing's energy was still around, like we were still being watched, but we never heard any growls or anything like that, or saw it again for that matter. And we grabbed her phone and left again, quicker than the first time. On top of everything else, I've heard stories from people here saying they've seen a lot more than just bears in this area, a lot more of these beings, the Kushtaka. It makes me wonder if they are really up here. that these things are actually shapeshifters, and they can change to whatever shape, being, or animal they want to at any given time. Anyway, that's my story. Take it or leave it. My story begins with my grandfather. Growing up in the house across from him, I learned everything about hunting and tracking game while growing up. Many consider that a loved privilege. We hunted deer together every season. It seemed like we were always catching one. And this is where my own personal experience comes in. So I have to go back just a little bit. I can remember being very young. I'm talking about 3 years old, a toddler. And my mom tells me I'd be up all night crying, afraid of something that had been tormenting me. My parents had no clue what it could have been because the only thing they saw was one black mass on the ceiling above my crib, staring and watching over me. It kept coming back every time, and one day, it was gone. But it wasn't there when my grandfather came in. He took care of his kids till now, at least until my mom got home. And then he told me how I kept having nightmares, but nothing really bothered him until he was trying to put a small blanket over me for bedtime, and I just came unglued. Ripping the blanket out of his hands, screaming for him to get that thing away from me. He looked at my mom, who had told him all about the other experiences I was having, or so she thought it would be best not to tell him, because he was always scaring me more when he heard stories like this, before thinking something bad was actually going to happen to me. He made us go outside where I'd pace back and forth, asking what it wanted, telling them if they didn't leave right then, I wouldn't either. He asked me what it looked like, but I could not give any good description of anything, really except its eyes. They were this void of nothing, large and black, kind of like a deer's but way different. Very, very dark. He told me he'd get rid of it and to go inside with my mom while she dressed me for bed. She did what she normally did when I had a bad dream, which was lay with me till I fall asleep. This time, though, it didn't work. As soon as we were settled down in my room, I could see this thing sitting at the end of my bed, almost hidden by the shadows, but clear enough. I could tell its outline was there. It began to creep slowly to where I was laying, until I could not handle it anymore, screaming for my grandfather. My mother tried everything in her power to shush me and to lull me back into a false sense of security so we could both try and get some rest, but eventually gave up and left for the rest of the night. Now, my grandfather came back inside after I went to sleep, following what could only be described as a very large humanoid canine with fiery red eyes. He waited until he saw it leave before coming back in, where I've overheard him telling my mom how it seemed like something was bothering me. So he tried to look around the house, didn't find anything. This happened one more time when I was 7, but this time, it had followed us home. We lived kind of out in the woods, so there really wasn't anywhere to hide outside or inside either, without having some kind of horde of rabid animals waiting to greet you outside at any given turn. That's when we decided that maybe our best bet would to just move to a different house in the country somewhere. That did not work out though. It still found us. We would leave for weeks at a time, trying to lose it, but no one could get rid of this thing. I know what you were thinking, but no, we never actually saw what was following us. Only that same black mass that kept reappearing everywhere we went. And just when it felt like there was no hope left, things took an even stranger turn. I had finally woken up after days of laying in my bed, afraid to move or even speak for fear that it might hear me and come back. My mom tells me that I started packing up all my stuff while she slept. She woke up, not knowing where I'd gone, or why, until she heard me calling my grandfather in the other room. He had asked what I was doing, and all I could tell him was that I knew exactly where it would be waiting for us, so we only needed to go there to get rid of it for good. He tried explaining to me not to worry about it anymore, but when I told him why I knew where to find it, he could not argue with me. We all managed somehow to sneak out of the house without being seen or heard by that thing. Only reason I'm sure this worked was because after that night, nothing ever came into our house again. I just know now that as an adult, looking back on these memories, that whatever this thing was, it wasn't some demon from hell or anything like that. Nor was it something I can explain away as some kind of rare disease or hallucination or mental illness. The only thing I know for sure is that it took my grandfather's life just 2 days later. It was almost like it just came to collect what it wanted, without any regard to anything else. And I'm sure of the one thing, if he hadn't taken the deal with that thing, that I'd never even be here typing this story out. Yes, the day that we were supposed to go there, to find this thing, he had apparently made a deal with it, with this entity, for it to take his life in order to leave me alone. Life for a life. Apparently he told my mother right after he did it, which is why and how I know about it. I still struggle with it even to this day. I miss my grandfather very much. I can only pray that it never comes back, wanting my life too. The first time that I probably encountered these things, it was probably 2:30 in the morning. I was walking home from a friend's house, and had just bought some beer, so I figured why not. We drank the entire case of it walking back. Coming up on my street, I could see two guys at the corner who looked pretty mad. So naturally, we took our last swigs and ditched the beers. I was walking past them when one of them, all out of nowhere, grabbed me, slamming me into a wall. I'm 5'2" and about 105 pounds. They dragged me to an alley, but I kicked and screamed as loud as I could, until something that sounded like a gunshot rang through the air, and then silence. I kept still thinking that if I moved, this would go worse for me. Their grips loosened though, as two more of them came upon me, behind me. They put what felt like duct tape over my mouth, carried me for a few blocks, and I heard something big. I don't know how to explain it though. It was loud. Moving along, they took me through an old abandoned parking lot, where they threw me down on the ground, next to two huge pits in the ground, one which had this scary tree growing out of the side. I didn't get a good look at it though, or anything else, because there were 4 or 5 of them standing around, guns pointed at me. One of them picked up my phone and called someone. They said, "We got her." There was silence until all of them began laughing really loud, screeching. Then, they stood still, staring at me. I couldn't make out what they looked like much, but once I realized it wasn't a person, I squeezed my eyes shut and to only open them when I heard one of them say, "Okay, she's ready." They all put their hands over me and began chanting in this strange, demonic-sounding language, and all their eyes were pure white, like their eyes were rolled in the back of their heads, but there was no pupil or iris. It was terrifying. After this went on for a few moments, they all backed away and stood in unison, where this smoky black vapor seemed to envelop all of them, and they began to form and materialize into a single dark figure, standing in the shadows, now maybe 30 feet away. This strange tingling sensation went all up through my body, blurring everything, and I nearly blacked out. When I woke up, several hours later, I had scratches and blood all over me, but I was completely unrestrained. No duct tape, nothing. After running for my life to my grandmother, she was bawling hysterically, telling me that what happened to me is that a very powerful young skinwalker is able to take the form and shape of other people, several of them actually, at the same time, and that apparently the ritual they performed, he was trying to steal my soul, but for some reason could not. The reason why, my grandmother explained to me, is because she put a protective prayer over me, and it kept this skinwalker from being able to steal my soul. This has been several years ago now, but I'm still terrified to walk out late at night now. I was 6 years old when I first saw a skinwalker. It had come down a road where my family and I were standing around a campfire. I remember it walked so strange on its hind legs, but ran just like a normal animal. It had long black hair covering its whole upper body. And I remember all of us sitting around the campfire and seeing this large animal or dog running off in the distance when it stopped and looked over at us. Somehow, my parents did not end up seeing it, but I'm sorry this is so short. It's freaked me out, and I really don't think I have a lot to say on it. My name is Cameron Browning, and I just recently moved to White Bluffs, Washington. This is because my mother wanted us to live near her parents, since they're getting older now. I'm a very shy person, so I didn't want to leave my friends where we were living. When we moved here, they gave us a house that had already been furnished and been kind enough to let us stay there until we started school up again in the fall. When we first moved here, I was at home by myself doing a lot of homework. It was roughly about 4:30 p.m., and I decided to take a break from it, watch some TV before dinner. My grandmother wasn't going to be coming over for another hour or so, if she did decide to come over at all, since she is very busy with her job as a nurse. Anyway, me being alone watching TV wasn't normal, because whenever my mom or brother would come home, they would complain about how I never watched TV with them, so this was kind of out of the ordinary. I just sat down on the couch, turned on the TV to some reruns of some show that I could not remember. My mind was occupied with the thoughts of me being alone in the house. Then, all of a sudden, it sounded like somebody had dropped something very heavy outside on the patio. I was startled for a few seconds until I went over to the window by the couch, only to see if anything might have actually appeared. As soon as I look out towards our window, I see what looked like two big wolves fighting over something. My first thought was, those things are huge, and complete total panic. But as I looked closer, because, to be honest, I could not look away, something between them caught my attention. They were fighting over the carcass of a dog. I immediately backed away from the windows, went to go check to make sure that both my mom and brother were not home yet, which they still weren't, by the way. I pulled out my phone, began looking up anything that might be relevant to what I just seen, hoping that maybe it would give me some reasonable explanation for all this. After about an hour-long search on Google about wolves and other things like skinwalkers or whatever else could come up with at the moment, nothing seemed to match exactly what I had just seen. All of a sudden, from the disappearance of these things, there was now noise coming from the kitchen, like something was trying to open the door. I checked it out and nothing seemed to be wrong. They just disappeared completely. Panicked and worried, I tried to go back to my homework. It just wasn't working out. Now, very shortly after this, there was loud banging on the windows right near the back, and I turned and screamed as I saw one of these large black wolves raising its paw as if to bang it against the window. It had these large glowing green eyes, and the most disturbing grin you could imagine, as if somebody had sewn human lips onto a dog's face and sewn them crooked. And its head was even more hideous. Parts of his face were missing fur and was kind of scaly and mangy looking. So I immediately called my mom, tell her what I'd seen. She seemed to be really angry at me, kept asking, why didn't I do this or why didn't I do that, instead of calling her. All the while, with a stern voice, she was scolding me for it. At this point, all these noises were coming from almost every part of the house, so I just decided to wait until somebody came home, no matter how long it might take for them to get help. I put my phone down, and something smashed one of our tall glass windows right next to where I was standing. This thing started growling at me and began moving towards the broken window. I just stood there in complete shock and panic at what was happening, realizing I was probably about to die, unable to move any inch of any of my body. It was now walking back and forth, waiting for me to make my next move, all the while growling very loudly at me with this huge grin on its face. I don't know why I never thought of it before, but I grabbed my phone and called 911. I explained to them what was happening, and they thought I was pranking them but told me they would send somebody out as soon as possible. And in that moment, the back window shattered, as well as the kitchen window, and these things started to come in the house. The large wolf, still with a huge grin on its face. The only thing I could really do in that moment was run right for the basement door, where I did, immediately slamming the door behind me, running down the stairs at full speed as 3 of these things had just entered into our house. I ran towards the other side of the basement and somehow fit my tiny self outside the little window that usually sits above the basement wall. You know the ones I'm talking about. They're tiny, but I'm a pretty stick-thin guy, so I was fortunately able to squeeze my entire body through without too much help. When you're being pumped full of adrenaline, it didn't take too long. After I made it out of the basement, I just started running frantically down the street, waving my arms, screaming for help. And just then, an officer, the one I believe responding to the call, was just coming down the street. He saw me, we talked, he picked me up, brought me back to the house, and went in armed while telling me to stay. I did not explain to him what had broken into the house, but that there were intruders, and I thought I was going to get hurt. I explained to him how I escaped, but when he went in, he told me that nobody was there, but he could see the windows were bashed in, and several people, from what he told me, had broken the house, and that there were long strands of black hair left behind. This was one of the most traumatizing events I've ever gone through. It took quite a long while after this to really settle back down and for everything to return to normal. And sometimes at night, outside my room, I could still see these shapes wandering around, as if maybe they're waiting for the right moment to come in again and get me. In case you don't know what a Skinwalker is, it's basically a witch from Navajo myth, capable of turning into any animal whenever they want, who has been labeled as evil by their own people. They've been doing this since ancient times. They aren't just known for being shapeshifters, however, but also for hunting down and killing anybody unlucky enough to run into one of their kind. They've been known to target entire families before. Unfortunately, they become hunted by these things and they're possessed or something equally awful until they get killed off. Skinwalkers are said to be capable of causing all sorts of different paranormal activity whenever they go to like poltergeist noises. They are a supernatural force. They are not to be reckoned with. My name is Joanne, and my husband Nathan and I moved out to the country so we can try and have a little peace and quiet after everything, with his sister recently dying and everything. But now, things are getting stranger by the day. Not only are we having strange lights in the sky, but I also believe that an old Navajo witch is trying to hex us and our family. I'm not gonna lie, we've already been through a lot. After Nathan's sister passed away from cancer, we both just wanted to get out of the city and try something new. A mental breath of fresh air. We chose this place because it was pretty close to civilization, but far enough away so you can see the stars much more clearly. I don't know if you've ever been out here, but let me tell you, there is always something happening in these parts late at night. First off, Nathan now stays up all night with his telescope, looking at space and trying to take photos on his phone. He thinks he's the only one he could see them. It never really bothered me until one day when I accidentally went into his photo album after borrowing his phone for a quick second. I literally had to ask him what he was looking at with his telescope. I swear to God, if it wasn't a planet or a star, talk about weird alien stuff happening in the sky. The first time I remember seeing something strange was when we were walking our dog after night. It was dark out, and we could see these red eyes staring back at us from across the field. Now, the odd thing about these eyes, they didn't have any white part around the eye, like you would expect to see. They were like glowing embers, just staring at me from inside some sort of goat skull face, or whatever those crazy hillbillies wear these days. But yeah, so after that happened, we walked a little further out in the field, and Nathan starts yelling about how he sees UFOs in the sky, like all the time. I look up and can see something swirling around inside this bright white light up in the sky. But it's moving so fast, I could not make out what it was. On another occasion, after seeing that thing from before, we were laying out on our backs, staring up at the stars. and these bright red lights started to fly over us. They were flying so fast that they were just blurs. They stopped for a second, right above us, and then just dissipated. This all happened in a matter of a few seconds. I think that whatever these UFOs are, or weird things in the sky, are brought on by the figures that walk around out here in the forest. What my husband believes are skinwalkers. I don't know if there's a connection to UFOs and skinwalkers, but my husband seems to think so. After that, we began to hear some odd things in the middle of the night, and they always seemed to be after we went inside for bed. The first thing was thumping on our roof, scaring us half to death. We didn't know what it could have been at the time. One morning, Nathan goes outside and finds footprints all around our house. So he starts asking me if I'd been up before him when I got up for work early one day. I thought he was crazy when he said this, but when I actually went out there myself with him, sure enough, there were these weird wolf prints all around my car and porch. That's not even the most disturbing part, though. After that, there were all kinds of things being left around my car. For instance, one day I come out, and my side mirrors are missing, and my windshield wipers are gone. I was so confused. I mean, it wasn't windy at all, so who would come by and steal those things off my car? Or did they blow off from the wind? I don't know. None of it really makes sense. I eventually found out why somebody would do that, but it's pretty creepy though, that they would come and try and steal something like that off my vehicle. Another time, Nathan comes home and all the oil is now leaking out of his truck. It didn't seem like a big deal at first until we realized how much oil had actually leaked out. The engine had almost burned up. Nathan got pretty mad about this, but everything was fine after several weeks when we had got it fixed. We assumed that was the end of it. Now, about 2 weeks later, Nathan was driving home from work again, and the truck began making really bad noises, just dying out on him. We were so scared to find out why this was happening, and it's even worse than what we'd expected. When Nathan had finally got his truck back, he told me he found all sorts of animal hair stuck inside the engine, everything along with some other very suspicious things. I'll never forget how freaked out he looked when he told me this. The hairs he showed me that were covered in gunk, but they were long and stringy, like an animal's, or like a big wolf or something. But before I go, I have another story for you. It's actually about my brother. It was last year sometime when his now fiancée lived in a townhouse with her sister, right outside of Rexburg, Idaho. One day, after waking up, she noticed something strange about the front yard. It's as if every single blade of grass was pushed over to one side, creating a trail that led off into the woods by their house. All three girls were scared, so they locked themselves in the townhouse for several hours until Nathan could come up from Salt Lake City, which he was already scheduled to come up and visit. When he arrived, nothing happened at all that night or during the weekend, but when they went home to Rexburg the following week, everything started up again. And then at nighttime, their door would randomly bust open, and the lock and the deadbolt would somehow be mysteriously undone. They quickly grabbed the things they needed and locked themselves in a hotel room for several days before they felt safe enough going back. It obviously wasn't a burglar. Everything was untouched. Nothing moved at all out of place. And the first night back, they tried to stay up all night, watching TV. It's common for your eyes to trick you when you're tired. They did not want this intruder to sneak up on them while they were asleep. It was just after 3 a.m, and something woke up one of the girls very suddenly. When she looked over at the door, she saw what Nathan had initially described as the most terrifying thing he'd ever seen, come walking through the house. It was not human. They were skinny white little beings that appeared to have rotting flesh falling off their body. They all terrified, screamed, and ran out of the house. Now, get this. They discovered that there was an ancient Indian burial ground just only a couple miles away from where they lived. I can't say for sure if that's at all connected, but considering how many weird things have happened to them since, I wouldn't be surprised at all. And then you take into consideration what happened to us. It really makes you wonder. I had been spending the summer in Coronado National Forest, which is located in the Huachuca Mountains. It's a beautiful area, and I loved going into the mountains to look at the stars at night and just take in the beautiful scenery around me. That was the forest and nature. On this particular night, I was really tired after a long day of work. The skies were clear, weather was great, and there was a new moon out. It should have been pitch black outside except for the light from my campfire burning down. I went to bed inside my tent right around 9:30 p.m. I always sleep with my knife within my arm's reach, in case you never know what might happen out there in the wilderness. Where I've lived before, in San Diego County, I've had some crazy things go down, so it always makes me feel safer. Call it an illusion or something, but I find it works. A few hours later, something woke me up. Something cold and hard pressed up against my face. I could feel a weight holding down on top of me. It was pressing so hard that it woke me from a sound sleep. I felt slightly panicked as I didn't know what it was. I opened my eyes to see the silhouette of a large man standing over me, his hands on both my shoulders pinning me down under him, with a large knife pressed against my face. Not the blade portion though, the flat portion. And there was only darkness around him, where his head and face should have been. Instinctually, I was to reach for my knife, which thankfully was right next to my waist. Holding the handle tightly in both hands with the blade pointed upwards at the mysterious figure now being above me. I tried pushing myself up off the ground to throw him off balance, but he was much stronger than I, and I could not budge under his weight. I used all my might, swinging the knife upwards, and was rewarded with a sharp pain in my hand. I felt wetness dripping down the handle of the knife onto my hands. When I looked up again, there was nobody above me. He seemed to have disappeared into thin air, like he never existed. What happened next is what scares me the most about this whole experience, and I'm still haunted by the memory. My campfire had burned down into embers at some point during the night, while I slept, but miraculously burst into flames once again, moments after whatever or whoever had been on top of me, disappearing without a trace. It wasn't until much later that I looked down at my hand, then realizing that something sharp had grazed it without my knowing, leaving just a small trail of blood. I tried convincing myself I had not had a nightmare and hallucinated it. I was looking around, waiting for it or him to come back, because he kind of just dematerialized once I knifed him. But the entire rest of the time I slept, I could just feel a presence around me, like something or someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to come back and do it again. I didn't waste any time. I packed up everything and began to leave, even though the fire that was just crackling embers was now a roaring flame, as if his spirit, or whatever energy he was, manifested as a roaring burning fire, a fire I should have put out. Generally, I have found that people who have had sightings of skinwalkers get very nervous about telling their stories, or get really angry and upset when asked. I understand. I get it. I've been through it myself. The ridicule, the embarrassment. It was actually a family member who had told me about Skinwalker Ranch. I didn't believe it at first, but today, I'm convinced that there is something very unnatural happening in the Indian Hills, Kansas. Let me give you some background knowledge on the area of the country. Fort Scott is smack dab between Joplin and Pittsburgh, Kansas. It's not exactly a bustling metropolis with 5-star hotels lined everywhere and top-shelf shopping malls lining every street corner. So, when people say they don't want to live here anymore, you take notice. People leave once their military deployment is over, and they complete their season for the seasonal work they do in St. Joe, which, by the way, has one of the highest unemployment rates in the state. They go home oftentimes to St. Joe, where things are more modernized. When they visit, there is a noticeable difference between the two towns. When you talk to people who have left Indian Hills for one reason or another, most leave because they feel very unwelcome. I'll give you a bit of background info here on the area as well. See, back in the 1980s and 90s, families were fleeing from what was believed to be the Satanic Panic era. Satanic ritual abuse cases were happening at local churches, schools, businesses, you name it. The Yogi Bear campground sat empty for years before being turned into another campground that remains active today by a church. In the 1990s, an 80-plus acre farm and house sold for only $4,000 due to it sitting abandoned after several reports of severe and violent paranormal activity. This is before it started getting reported back in the late 80s. People would tell you that they just felt wrong there, or there's something not right about the area, and nobody wanted to live there. In fact, going back to the public records of the house, there had been no single owner or family owners that had lived there for more than 12 months at a time, all stating the same thing: severe, violent poltergeist activity. So, what do I think is going on here? Well, back in 2010, an apartment complex was set ablaze by a young man who claimed he was possessed. He lived at the complex with his mother and sister. After setting the fire to their apartment, he walked out of the burning building with no injuries, and the very next day shot himself in front of his friends and classmates. Residents believe this happened because they were being attacked by ghosts, and he himself was possessed. Now, why would somebody feel that way, unless something truly evil has taken up residency here? Right after the man killed himself, several residents reported seeing shadows walking around their homes at night. These are actual quotes from people claiming to have seen these things. One woman actually stated that she had seen people standing in her own backyard staring into her house. She also claimed that she saw somebody walking through her kitchen one night, but when she turned on the lights, there was nobody there. Another man reported seeing shadows running all across his walls and ceiling every time he got up to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night. He has since moved out for the state of fear for his life and his family's safety, because he believed that there are evil spirits that are trying to possess him or harm him or his family. So what happened? You might ask yourself, if something did indeed take place here, why haven't I heard about it till now? Well, I live here. This is my hometown, just like many of you reading this right now. I don't think it's a coincidence that the town has been hit hard with hard times, and some very strange and unlikely events happening in such a small geographical location. Is Indian Hills truly the gateway to hell? I cannot say for sure, but if something doesn't change soon, we may all find out. Now, that all covers the paranormal side of it, but what I wanted to talk about today was how there is the Skinwalker side of it. Now, before you're quick to brush this post off and say, oh, Skinwalkers don't exist, let me remind you that it's been reported that Skinwalker presence will cause a massive upsurge in paranormal activity. And I believe that due to the ancient Indian burial grounds around the area and the other Skinwalker sightings, that all the paranormal happenings, the demonic spirit activity, everything that would link back to the insane, satanic ritual abuse and everything is interconnected, is all due to, in part, the Skinwalker activity. They are the gatekeepers. They are the ones causing everything. And they lie in wait in the shadows, controlling everything like puppet masters, using demonic spirits and entities to do their will, to harm people. This way, they don't ever have to step out from the shadows, revealing themselves. They can control, destroy, and drive out an entire community and town, just from their sheer minions. Thanks for listening. I grew up roughly 30 miles northwest of Los Angeles, and one of my favorite pastimes is to go into the nearby mountains and explore. When we were younger, we would ride our dirt bikes, but as we got older, that turned into four-wheeling and hiking. I can remember this one time. We were coming back down the mountain, and we came up to a clearing, and just below us was a small town that I did not know existed. We decided to stop and take a better look, so we went down towards it. After getting off our bikes, we started walking around and looking in windows. All of a sudden, something caught our eye. there was what looked like somebody hanging from the roof of one of the buildings. Upon closer inspection, it turned out to be none other than some sort of dummy. We quickly figured out what was going on. The place had been used for filming horror movies due to its isolated location, where you can do anything you want without anybody ever knowing or even caring. Apparently, it had been abandoned for some time, while we found out that the way things looked the way it had been was just a little creepy, in my opinion. We heard a noise behind us, like something had just fallen, and that was big. We saw a light that seemed to be coming from behind one of the houses. At first, I thought it was somebody coming out of their house to see what was going on, but when we got a closer look, the person or light never showed. We got close enough where I could make out what it was, and what it looked like. It looked very strange, and in a way, I can't exactly describe without sounding crazy. Out stepped this person wearing a black hoodie, and a face with dead eyes and almost plastic-looking skin. I couldn't take my eyes off of him, and he began to slowly kind of move away from us, stopping right about 15 feet away. It felt as if time itself had stopped, and the only sound that could truly be heard over our heavy breathing was the faint sound of crickets off in the distance. It turned a light on again, but a light illuminated from his body, and very slowly in front of us, ascended about 20 feet in the air, as if he had levitated, and he began chanting all sorts of hideous, horrible, demonic things, before exploding into a ball of light. My friends and I, we ran as fast and as hard as we ever could have, not talking a word about what we had just seen. From what I know, and what I've studied, this was a Skinwalker, but I don't know for sure, which is why I'm posting this. I'm hoping somebody can answer me. This sighting happened in northern Idaho, March of 2015. I was driving home from a late night of working at a gas station. It was cold, windy, and snowy. I turned up the heat in my car as high as it would go, let my four-wheel drive take me home, since there was several inches of snow on the roads. As I drove down this stretch of road that leads to my neighborhood, I came around a curve and saw something going towards the road ahead of me, very fast. At first, it looked like a naked old man sprinting. He was very slender and wearing all black. But as I approached closer in the car, his legs were so much longer and thinner than any human's legs should ever be. He also seemed to be more loping and hopping than anything else. I kind of slowed down as I passed him to get a look, and then sped up. And right as I passed him, he kind of veered off into the woods right next to me. This will always stay in my mind. When I passed him, he, or maybe I should say it, turned to look at me, and it was the head of a coyote, but the body of a man and what I can describe as black robes. He turned to look at me, turned away, and disappeared. I think I saw and dealt with a shapeshifter. I know they're true now. I know they exist. I live in the Manti, Utah area with my wife and kids. One night, when I was younger, in my early 20s, I was up late, working on a vehicle in our driveway, when my dad comes out to look at what I was doing. I was startled by his sudden appearance and instinctively drew my pistol, aiming it at him. He noticed the gun and told me to put it away and come inside. We sat in our living room for a while when we heard rustling outside. Somebody was walking around outside of the house. I didn't pay much attention to it since I thought one of our neighbors might be visiting them or something. Not really thinking too much about it until we heard two low growls coming from the window behind. Now, growing up on a farm in Nebraska, I've heard plenty of predators before, but none of them sounded like this. Whatever made that noise wasn't an animal that I'd heard before. It had a sort of creaky, grunty, growly sound. I asked my father what the sound was, and he said he didn't even hear it, even though I had been raised in an area that allowed me to be familiar with pretty much every animal's sound. I had never heard anything that sounded like that before. The longer we sat there listening to these things outside, the more uncomfortable I became. I could feel that something wasn't right. But again, Dad told me it must have just been our neighbors and suggested that let's go outside and investigate just in case. Surely whatever made the noises by now had been gone. Sitting at the round kitchen table, talking about the day's events for a bit, we began hearing other noises and growls coming from outside. The kinds where it sounds like something was in pain. We went out again to investigate, but didn't find anything this time either. It seemed whatever was making that noise had disappeared for good after that. But it made me wonder if there are other things in the world at large that I don't know about. Hello. I would like to start off by saying that this took place in either 2007 or 2008. I can't really remember which, but I do remember it was summer. I had just moved out here from California to help out my grandmother with her bills and stuff. She needed help around the house. She was getting older, and I would go to work with her during the day. Well, I woke up one night. I heard what sounded like kids outside, right outside my bedroom window. But it was late, so I thought maybe it was the wind or something. But then all of a sudden, it sounded like wood breaking and stuff crashing around. Instinctively, me being the hothead that I am sometimes, gets out of bed, thinking it's some idiot kids out there causing trouble. After throwing on some clothes, I went out to yell at them that lived down the street from where we lived. As soon as I opened the door to go outside, all of these things started growling. And at first, I could see that there were two large black shapes huddled over something on the ground before I saw their green eyes from underneath there. There were 6 of them in total. I was completely horrified, and I quickly walked back inside, locking the door. They disappeared after that, but every now and again at nighttime, I would hear them outside. I would hear these voices. I would hear these sounds, this growling noise, and the sounds of somebody talking, but in hushed tones and whispers like somebody frantically speaking. It stopped after a while, but to this day, when I sit here and think back on it, I still get chills thinking about what happened on that summer night. This is why now I prefer to stay inside, especially during the nighttime. Who knows what would have happened to me if I never saw them and had mistakenly stepped out of the porch into the yard where they were. In the fall of 2009, I had an encounter with a Skinwalker, or at least I think it was one. The reason I believe it is because my family has lived in the same house since 1874, when it was built by my great-great-grandfather, Hector Montoya. We are members of the Jemez Pueblo tribe and live in northwest New Mexico, which is Pueblo country. We are surrounded by native reservations, which is where I assume this creature came from. Or maybe that's just my naivety talking. My family and I went to bed right around 10 p.m. on a Thursday night. All was calm. However, there were still strange things going on in the house. It had this electrical buzzing inside of it, along with flickering lights that none of us could quite figure out. All the electrical was fine. My parents claimed they would look after it after they had gotten some sleep, but nobody expected what happened next. Right at about 1:30 a.m., my younger sister starts screaming for help. Something was attacking her. She claims that she felt someone or something jump onto her bed and try to choke her out while tugging on the flesh of her face. She said that she was screaming so loud, she felt like her life was in danger. When my father rushed into the room, he saw what looked like a shadow of a figure through the window. But before he could grab his gun, it jumped off, ran through the roof, and ran away at an incredible speed. Now everyone who knows anything about skinwalkers knows that they are fast creatures and can shapeshift into animals, or even worse, take on a spirit form. However, despite this knowledge, I still did not believe until a couple of weeks later, on a Friday night, we were all home alone watching movies when there was another attack by the creature. My brother came face to face with it while walking outside to take care of our dogs, whom, may I add, seemed to be barking like crazy, even though it was in the middle of the night. He said he saw what looked like an animal running across our front yard, jumping on top of our neighbor's house, which is about 50 feet away from ours. When he went back inside to tell my father about it, they heard something hollering at them through the window. But this time, they caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a man wearing some type of animal skin, with his face covered in red paint and blood. After what happened, we all kind of just sat there, not knowing what to do, till around 3 a.m. We decided to use some raw meat as bait. For almost 3 hours, nothing came, so we thought maybe it had just gone away. But then, around 5 in the morning, when my little brother woke up for school, we saw it in our living room. My dad said he just stood there, staring at it, until he was brave enough to pull out his gun and shoot it in the arm. We all heard a loud yelp and assumed it had run off. But after 10 minutes of silence, there was now so much commotion outside that every dog within miles began barking like crazy. My sister looked out the window to see what was going on, told everybody to come look. She believed it may have transformed into something else before making its getaway. And when I say commotion, I mean police sirens, ambulances, fire trucks, you name it. Whatever was there must have been bad. Every kind of emergency vehicle you can think of was in the distance. The weird thing about this is that my dad works with the tribal police, and none of them would tell him what had happened. They did say that a lot of people got seriously injured, or worse. I found out a couple of days later from my sister's friend who lived in that area that she was walking her dog and saw a woman being dragged by some type of large coyote with red eyes. Skinwalkers are evil creatures. In fact, they will use their powers for dark things, such as hurting others mentally or physically to do their bidding. So, if one is aiming to do something terrible, make sure you don't get in its way, because I guarantee you, it won't think twice about taking your life. I was in my early 20s when this happened. It was a very, very hot day. Very little wind and no clouds in the sky. I decided to go for a run along the local bay. It was during this time of year that we had a bad influx of strange lights over the water at nighttime. My sister and I had been out on my boat earlier in the week and saw some of these lights ourselves, which were absolutely fantastic. I ran for about 30 minutes before reaching one of my favorite spots in the bay, where you could see seals, lots of birds, and some potential ships coming in and out of the port. This day, they were more than normal, as some big company was having a convention down by the docks. Lots of people making noise with their boats and laughing and drinking. Trying to find a good spot to sit and watch for a bit before running back, I saw what looked like a man or animal standing on top of one of the medium-sized ships. As I watched it slowly walk down the side of the ship, this is where my thought was, oh, it's going to jump in the water. I sat there for about 10 minutes, watching it swim in the water. Then it would descend under the water and change form into something more hideous. It would come back up and surface, and change again to part man and part something. I don't even know. I watched this go on for about 25 minutes, realizing that I was seeing a shapeshifter. I believe that whatever this creature was had to have been a skinwalker of some kind. My name is Mary, and I'm writing this in anonymously. In 1999, my husband at the time had been divorced from his first wife for about a year. They were having problems with their eldest daughter, who was 12 at the time. In order to rid her of her bad habits they thought she was having, they took her to a medicine man who lived on a California Indian reservation near San Diego. Every day, all summer long, there were dogs just going crazy outside the house. It got so bad that even my husband wanted to move closer to where he worked in Poway, California. It was too difficult to work from home due to all the strange activity and things that were going on. After we moved into our new place, he went back up north every week until school started again, helping his ex-wife until their daughter started school. I awoke one night and heard a static noise right outside my front door. I opened the door, and there was nothing. Nothing but the dogs that were barking like mad all around me. I decided to sit at the table in my living room, looking out the window that faced our carport. We had 5 large windows in our living room. Looking out into the dark, I saw 3 huge black figures walk by every other window on 2 legs, arms swaying back and forth. I cannot express to you how terrified I was. Although I did not recognize this as some supernatural entity, but 3 intruders who were going to break in, rob, and who knows what else. To this day, I'm sure who I saw, but refused to come forward with the story. My husband woke up when he heard me running outside, in the back, in the darkness all alone, when he could hear these things in the front yard. I guess he got his gun and shot at them, and they all ran on all 4s and ran away. He knew what these were. He had grown up and dealt with skinwalkers before. But we never talked about it again, until sometime later when his own ex-wife told him that their daughter had seen what looked like her father. Only she claimed it wasn't her dad. It had yellow eyes, but had knocked on her window, tried to get her to let him in. His voice was very similar but more distorted and staticky, and his cadence, the way he spoke, was also different. This girl was so scared of what she saw, she told her own mother, but wouldn't tell anybody else about it for a while. The medicine man would not even let them ask any questions, because he said if they did, the demons would follow his daughter home. He claims that these were also skinwalkers, and they could take your DNA to turn into you and mimic you, or something as equally as strange. After this incident, every time I heard dogs barking outside our house, my husband would start up north again to help out his ex-wife until their daughter got used to finally being back at school. One night, after he came home from working with them all day long, I was busy sleeping on the couch. I had fallen asleep after reading a book. He comes in and wakes me up, tells me that his daughter had seen one of these things again outside, trying to attack the dog. The description the daughter gave was about the same thing. Yellow piercing eyes, taking the form of her father, and after nearly killing the dog, ran off. Now it was starting to torment the house. None of the kids in the family could really sleep after that, and they would spend the rest of the night in their mom's bed, afraid to close their eyes. I want to see this family protected from any kind of ridicule on my part. I realize there's not much I can do myself, but I feel that in part of sharing this with you today, getting the information out there that these things are dangerous, and they can take shape of other people and animals to do whatever evil bidding they decide. I just hope there are those out there who hear this and take it a little more seriously. Thank you. This was in the early morning hours of New Year's Day in 2017. I was driving along I-5, south, towards Medford, Oregon, from California with his girlfriend at the time. It was about 6 or 6:30 in the morning, and we were still about an hour north of Grants Pass. We saw something large moving ahead of him on the road. First, he thought it was a deer, since there's quite a bit of forest along this stretch of highway, but once they got closer, he realized what it actually turned out to be. The creature heading straight for the highway, but it crossed over into the woods again before reaching them, disappearing from view completely. He wasn't sure what he had seen, and his girlfriend didn't see it at all. She had just glanced up, asked if everything was all right, continued to sleep in the passenger seat, since she was tired from partying of the night before. He is just now willing to submit his sighting, as there was quite a bit of disbelief, even pressure from him around those who were not aware of his experience. He's still not sure what it is, but is open to suggestions and theories on what he saw. I had to write this. I still can't believe what happened. It all began back last year when my family and I were traveling around the country, trying to find a new place to live after we lost the house in New Orleans due to Katrina. We found this cute little town that reminded me of home, so we took it. Right off the bat, you can tell there was something different about this place, but nothing too weird. The people seemed nice enough. There was a lot of them actually who had been there for generations, stretching all the way back to Civil War. They had some old traditions and odd ones too, like burying their dead below their homes, rather than in a graveyard where they lived. But hey, why not try something new, right? The town was called Meadow, and it was located just south of Little Rock. We found a plot of land for sale with an old abandoned house on it. We decided to buy it up, fix it up as best we could. We did not have much money, but we knew we wanted to settle down somewhere, and this seemed like our best chance. Fixing the place up wasn't too hard. There were only a few things wrong with the house after all. First, it smelled like rot, mostly like from flood damage or something rotting in the walls. Second, there were weird scratch marks all over the kitchen floor and countertops. The house happened to be above ground. And lastly, and scariest of all, there were what looked like claw marks on every door, including the doors that led outside. The claw marks freaked me out a bit, but I shrugged it off in time and convinced myself that they were just from some stray animal trying to get into the house or something like that. The scratching on the floor was alright too, although we did end up throwing away all the rugs, which seemed to help with keeping down any new scratching sounds. We never heard them at night, luckily. We found this old decrepit-looking chair, covered in dust and cobwebs, sitting near one of our couches. Decided to put it in our bedroom for no particular reason, other than we didn't want it taking up space anywhere else. We ended up finding a few pieces of clothing tucked between the couch, but we didn't think much of it. Then things really started to happen. My first time hearing the scratching wasn't too bad. I was sitting in bed, deciding to take a shower. While I was showering in the bathroom, the doorknob began to shake as if somebody or something was trying to get in. Once I came back into the room though, whoever or whatever was there disappeared. And it wasn't until about a week later that I would hear anything else as far as strange sounds go. We were all awakened at 2:30 in the morning by what sounded like heavy footsteps. Stairs in our room were shaking. It was just one set of footsteps though. I couldn't believe it. My husband and son were in different rooms, and we all heard it. Then we heard a door slam, so we had gone downstairs to check it out. There was nobody there, but our stuff had been knocked over for some reason. So we tried to straighten everything up and fell asleep again. This would be the only time anything like this would happen all year long, even during the winter, when things usually got a lot worse. Then August came around, and time of school started back up for kids, my boy at least. Things started back up again. The scratching sounds became constant, sometimes waking us up. I was too tired from work though to get up. The footsteps had continued through the night, but none of us ever left our rooms to investigate them for some reason. Then, one night, things got pretty bad. If you can imagine that even being possible. Predictably, the scratching started again, but this time, there were now different voices coming out over top of it, almost as if there was a chanting or a singing. I don't know how else to explain it. I'm not one for believing in this kind of stuff, after all, mind you. So we all ran downstairs, turned on every light we could, sat together, waiting for whatever it was to come back down. Well, luckily, it never did. But the scratching got louder, and then just stopped completely. We all felt eerily calm after that, so we sat in silence for a while, before deciding to go back to bed. My son was the first one up in the morning, waking us all up at around 6. He had found a dead animal on his bedroom floor. It looked like somebody had broken in and placed this dead coyote on the ground. Its throat was visibly torn out. He called for me when I came in the room, and I saw it. This was one of the many times strange stuff happened, but it never happened again afterwards. At least an animal body being left in the room. Jump ahead to February of this year, 2017. I had just gotten home from work, and my son came bursting through the front door, telling me he saw something outside in our backyard briefly before running off into our forested area at the back of our property. I got him inside immediately, but by the time I went out there, myself, nobody was anywhere to be found except a fresh set of wolf footprints leading it directly into the denser part of the woods. I had my husband go out there looking with a flashlight and a gun for about an hour. He came back shaking his head, telling me that although these did lead into the part of the woods where it was denser, they just appeared to stop suddenly, as if whatever it was just vanished into thin air. He tried to inspect it and investigate further but could not find anything. A couple of days passed with no further activity, and my son tells me that when I was at work, he heard a blood-curdling scream come from outside the house, only for him to look out the window in response and see this large coyote walking around on two legs, kind of limping, going in and out of the woods before disappearing again. I had tried my best to do some research on the property and the history of the house, only to really find nothing. But when I asked around, I was told by some people in our community that they've had some Native American problems. I guess back in the 1800s, when part of this area was settled, there was a mass Native American grave where hundreds upon hundreds of Native bodies were dumped, and it seems that ever since then, massive amounts of ghost sightings have been occurring. Other people talked about strange upright wolves running around the woods, and what one older gentleman suggested to me was that there was a big alpha male wolf spirit, is what he described, that was causing all the paranormal happenings around the community. And then it sounds like we saw it ourselves. I'm really not sure what to think about all this, even now. I lived on a ranch in northern Florida for many years. One day, in the fall, while hunting, I somehow got lost. It was getting dark, so I just decided to lay down in a clearing where I'd be able to see the stars. When suddenly, this upright coyote comes out of the woods, stops about 30 feet from me, turns back around and walks into the woods as if nothing happened. It was completely black and terrifying. I will never forget it. But what I don't get is why did it turn around and casually walk back into the woods? And the weird thing was, before it walked out of the woods, I swear to God, I heard a woman's voice say in a strange tone, like, "You shouldn't have come this way." It gave me chills even now as I think about it. It was like an old, scratchy woman's voice, like through an old AM radio. I'm not sure what that was all about, but easily one of the most frightening things to have ever have happened to me. In the winter of 2009, I was working the night shift at a gas station here in Augusta, Maine. I had taken up hunting with my friend and older brother that year. We were out to hunt coyotes. We didn't have a lot of money, so we were pretty limited on equipment. I only had a .22 rifle, along with my buddy, who had his old .30-30, because he wanted me to carry his gun since mine shot further. We came across some fresh tracks while driving around, looking for some good spots. It looked like one or two coyotes went through there recently, but were gone by the time we got into position. We spent about an hour waiting for them to come back, and we realized we might be in the wrong spot due to lack of activity. We decided to go on the other side of the field and try our luck there. We drove through some brush, came across a mauled section where two coyotes were seen fighting. One was really behind, so I figured it would be an easy kill for me since he was between us and my buddy, ready to fire if he needed to. We shot it once, but only mine hit its target, while my friend's seemed to bounce off. He had just bought that rifle, used no iron sights or optics, so I told him don't worry about it. My coyote took off into the forest, while his friend went running in the opposite direction, towards a deep thicket on top of a hill right next to a house. As we got closer, I realized something just felt wrong. But with the adrenaline still pumping, I figured it might just be nerves. It wasn't until we got up next to it that I noticed something was really off. The coyote didn't look like a coyote at all. Its fur was darker. It looked almost black, even in the moonlight. And its face was much different, like it was deformed. And the way it moved was very odd. There were also no sounds of crickets, and the night was quiet. It gave us a really bad feeling, so we just left it be, and actually didn't even bother chasing after it. We jumped in my truck, took off back towards the gas station, since we would need help tracking something like that down. After about 15 or so minutes, we decided to turn around and go after it. We went back out there 3 more times throughout the night, never found anything, even with the trail of its blood. I'm not sure what we saw that night, but I know it was not just a coyote. I've been hunting since I was very little, and I have never seen anything like that before. It was almost as if it were something else entirely. Maybe like something wearing a coyote's skin to fool us into thinking that perhaps this was an ordinary animal, until we got too close. Whatever it was, it messed with us for months, without even knowing about it. My friend had nightmares for weeks afterwards about being chased by some weird monsters in the woods. Now, about 2 years later, while he was home on leave from the Navy, my buddy came over to see how things were going. So I told him all about this story while we shot at some tin cans with his old rifle. I told him about how I wanted to post it on Reddit, so he said he would write up something similar, but not nearly as bad as the first time we had seen it. He went back home after spending a couple of days with family and me. I'd figured I'd give him a few weeks before sending him a message, asking what had happened. Now, 4 or 5 months had passed without hearing from him. I began calling around to see if anybody had any idea where he was. He was not answering his phone. I finally got in contact with one of his friends, who told me that they were out drinking with my buddy, and he broke down about seeing this weird thing again. Apparently, he could not stop talking about it. He said that he had taken him home, made sure he was safe for the night. I mean, he wouldn't shut up about what had happened. Even kept begging his friend to go out there with him again, despite saying we should have left it alone. The next day, his friend told me my buddy had just disappeared. All of his stuff was still at his parents' house, where they had been staying. Nobody has seen or heard from him since. But I get that feeling that whatever we saw in those woods is the reason why. That's pretty much the gist of what happened between us and this Skinwalker, or whatever you want to call it. It may sound like I'm making this whole thing up, but after reading these stories online, it feels like there might be some truth behind them now. So now that you know how everything started, let me tell you about my friend, what he wrote, and his encounter with this awful thing. And keep in mind that my friend's post is very long and descriptive, so I've tried to sum it up into short paragraphs for easier reading. This all takes place over the course of 7 nights. Here you go. When I was about 13 or so, I got a part-time job working at a gas station near an apple orchard in southern New Hampshire. We had around 1,000 acres of woods behind our house, which people were constantly dumping things because it was state game land. So no hunters wanted their time looking for deer back there, so people used it as an excuse to dump trash. My dad's best friend was in the Navy at the time, and came to live with us after a while with going through a bad divorce, especially coming back on mid-tour leave. So me and him decided to go out there one night, right around midnight. He wanted to shoot something. He had his Ruger 1022. We got back there just before it started getting light out, thinking that anything still alive out there would be easy targets for our guns, due to the lack of light. It didn't take much time after that, until we heard something moving big in the woods, but it sounded too heavy to be deer, so I was already preparing myself for a fight. Right after we heard it, it started rustling around, and a very large black bear came out from under some coverage and just stared at us, blankly. It must have been the first time it came to our area. It didn't know what kind of threat we were, compared to those that had chased it away before. So my friend had asked me if this was something we could scare off, like a mountain lion he saw one night at his house. I told him no as quietly as I could, with my heart literally beating out of my chest. All sorts of horrible thoughts started going through my mind right then and there. But after about 30 seconds or so, this bear It was just acting different. It wasn't acting like a normal black bear, and you could tell something was up with it. Upon closer look, its eyes looked more human than you could imagine, and it kind of just waltzed off after giving us a strange expression. So on to the second night. After that happened, I just wanted to go home. But my friend said he had one more idea for us to try out, asking if it was alright if we went up to the hill behind our house to see how much more noise we could make without scaring away any game. After saying sure and waiting for about 10 minutes, he pulled out a big knife and said something like, "Let's hope this works." My friend was pretty strong for his age, so after traversing through some rugged terrain between the base of the hill and where we were, he began hacking away at branches with his knife, trying to make as much noise as possible. As soon as he got tired of doing that, he threw his knife to the ground, and we started shouting at the top of our lungs while clapping our hands together. It didn't take long before we heard rustling in the leaves off in the distance and saw something big again moving very quickly up ahead. It was that same black bear from before, but this time was running after us, acting very aggressive. We retreated back to the house, and my friend told me that he was doing this specifically to pull out what he thought was a skinwalker back in the woods. He told me, normally, when you're attracting quote-unquote game, you're not going to try and make as much noise as possible, but we were trying to lure out this skinwalker, which I was convinced lived back in those woods, and I was right. If you notice that bear, its eyes looked different, it acted different, and the way it came after us after making that noise. Pretty sure that's exactly what we were dealing with. I don't know why, but after he told me this, I felt a little bit better. He said so after grabbing my father's shotgun, told me to get in the car with him. He seemed hesitant at first, but it sounded like what we were doing with our time was possibly illegal. He even offered that if we happened to get caught, he would pay for everything. And we both agreed that if something came out of the woods trying to hurt us, there wouldn't be any point in trying to load all the shells into the shotgun fast enough before it could do anything drastic. So, instead, we decided to bang on things with sticks while yelling as loud as possible like last time and hoping it worked. After getting back up there, something big was moving around again, and we started banging on things as fast and yelling like we could. We stayed up there for about 20 more minutes before I literally begged him to take me back to the house so I could get away from whatever was out there that night. It was scaring me really bad, even more after he told me that he heard something running between all around the houses. What my friend was doing, what I would later find out, is he was trying to do everything he could, make all the noise he could to try and bring the skinwalker out in the open so he can kill it. Little did I know that he was actually a skinwalker hunter, or so he called himself, but anyway, when my friend would later take me back home, after this, him and his family decided to go on vacation. He'd went out of town with his sons, and at home, I was by myself, and I started to feel really cold while seeing shadows moving around everywhere. Obviously, this was the skinwalker enacting revenge. I believe it was casting evil spirits into the house, in retrospect. So now fast forward a couple more days, and my Navy friend is back. But regardless of how everything has gone so far, I don't think anything could prepare me for what I saw next with my own two eyes, while taking a shortcut home through an alleyway between houses. I saw shadows and blurriness, suddenly starting to make sense as if they were following me. What I saw wasn't a man or a woman, or any normal living creature that I could tell, but all of my senses were telling me to run as fast as I could without looking back, if not for the fact that it seemed to be reaching out at me. But I heard my friend yell. He was right around there and took a shot at this thing, striking it before it fled. This thing isn't human, and if the stories are true, it definitely doesn't need any help from us. It already knows everything there is to know about this world. It is supernatural after all, including what happens and what happens before we die. I don't want to believe anything like this exists, but the fact that it is able to shapeshift and take forms of a bear, or a person, or whatever it wants, is startling and unnerving. This was me learning for the very first time that skinwalkers and the things that go bump in the night are very, very real. This was back in October of 2017. I saw some strange creatures. I was at my uncle's house in the backyard with my parents and a few cousins. My cousin had this spinning wheel thingy that you could either ride or push around. I got on it, and while going around, I heard some dogs barking in the distance. Not unusual, as there were Doberman pinschers in the dog pen nearby. But after a while of riding around, I started hearing something else too, like an animal rustling through leaves or grass. The thing was getting closer to me, but all else remained quiet besides the animals outside. Suddenly, they stopped making noise, which made me freeze in my spot on the wheel for a second, before checking to see if anybody else noticed anything unusual. That was when I noticed I had ridden out of the yard and was a lot closer to the woods at the edge of the property than I had thought. I could still very visibly see the rest of the family, who all appeared to have not even seen that I wasn't right there. My dad and uncle were taking care of the grill. My aunt and mother busy setting up the table, and my cousins were just messing about with a Nerf gun. Even though I could have just yelled and they would have been able to hear me, their voices seemed really far away. I mean, even the dogs from down the street seemed far more quiet. I felt this weird urge to scream and run, but also like I was rooted to the spot, frozen and could not move, just stare into the tall grass that just moments before had been rustling, and now silent and still. I knew instinctively there was something there. The best way I can describe it, it would be like when you're underwater. That kind of muffled sound where you know stuff is going on around you, but you can't quite make it out. It sounded almost like there were low voices coming from the tall grass. We'd been warned not to play in that grass in this particular spot that leads into the woods behind my uncle's house, mainly because of snakes. But this did not sound like slithering or hissing. Then, the voice-like noise stopped, and there was more rustling again, like something sure as hell was moving in there. Thankfully, sounding like it was heading back into the trees, and not towards I. But I still just waited, feeling unable to move. To this day, I am unable to tell you exactly what emerged from that grass and crawled into the woods. There were two of them, both very similar in size. The best example of what they should have been, I guess, would be a deer. They looked like some sort of deer, but wrong. Deer gone wrong, horribly disfigured or mutated. That's literally the best way to describe what they were. And no, they moved like they weren't used to being on four legs. They acted uncomfortable, awkward, stilted and stunted. I thought maybe those were the injured or deformed. But in all honesty, they just looked wrong. As soon as they disappeared back into the woods, I felt like a release, and all of a sudden, all the sounds from around me came back clear, and I heard and saw my mother call and waving at me, and telling me the hot dogs were now ready, and to come wash up. I never told them at all what I saw, because frankly, I don't know. And also, they probably wouldn't believe me if I did. Just in case they had, I want to keep thinking I imagine it. It's really the only way I can sleep at night. But I have a feeling deep down what I saw is more real than everything around me. This was long before I knew what a skinwalker was. But one time when I was 17, I was walking home from high school when I just got this discernible feeling I was being watched by something, not someone. I looked around, following my instincts. I saw nothing but a bush moving out in the distance. as if something was hiding behind it. It had to be a skinwalker. And that same year, my grandmother had had a ton of encounters with these beings, and they were constantly following her around, which meant that I too was now a target for these same beings. I had gotten so used to seeing them, I wasn't just afraid, I was always afraid. Of course, the thing with skinwalkers is that unless you know about them, know what to look for, you never even knew they existed, which is the entire point. They can possess, if that is the right word, anyone or anything. I live in constant fear. I wish there was some sort of test, like you see in the movies with demons. You know, throwing holy water at them, and if they sizzle, you kinda know. But there is nothing like that for a skinwalker. And even if there was, I can't just walk about pouring holy water over people, just in case. I think you kinda understand. But I guess once you know what you're looking for, you can tell. It's often the giveaway is the eyes. The way they move, and it seems wrong. Especially if they are walking in animal form. Ever seen a dog that looked overly intelligent? A deer or coyote that didn't walk quite right, as if it wasn't used to being on 4 legs? How about a person in the street? Someone you've never seen before, and yet something seemed both off and yet familiar. Despite never having laid eyes on them before, they seem to turn up several times throughout your day, and yet you may have traveled miles. I've had all of those things. One of the worst and most terrifying experiences was when I was followed for almost an entire day by what I am sure was one person using many different people to walk in. How could I tell? How did I know that somebody else was using all these different people to follow me around? Their eyes and smile, every single one of those very different people. From young, old, male, female, they all had that same dead look in their eyes. That same awful smile. So yeah, I'm always afraid. I'm always glancing over my shoulder, looking in the dark corners and shadows. You would be constantly on edge too if you have ever seen a regular-looking dog smirk at you, smile in only a way that a human could possibly do, as if a human was trying to control every feature. And you want to know the worst thing? What is even worse than literally knowing if people around you are actually them or something else? That is the worst. Why are they following me? If the original target, for want of a better word, was my grandmother, who is the only person who truly believes, why did they jump from her to me? Or is more my family under attack? What do they want? I just can't find the right answers, and I don't know who to talk to. Or at least who would be willing to talk to me about this. I just want to know why they won't leave me alone. I don't want to spend my entire life being afraid, always looking behind me, never trusting anybody. It's ruined friendships, relationships. Is that what they want? I'm hoping maybe, just maybe, you or somebody can send me in the right direction, or at least tell me that I'm not alone and I can leave them somehow. I just want a normal life again. Is that too much to ask? Can you help me? When my grandfather died when I was just at the tender age of 11, he left behind an old journal that had some crazy stories written inside of it about his time on the Navajo reservation back when he was much younger. He had many written stories about these creatures called Skinwalkers. Of course, I didn't believe any of them. But after what happened the other day, I'm beginning to think that these creatures are real. Not all the stories in the journal were necessarily new to me. I had heard some of the encounters before, but usually, if grandfather began to tell one, my mom would cut him off and give him the look. Sure, she wanted us to know about it and embrace our heritage, but also, she didn't want us constantly looking over our shoulders, wondering if that dog, horse, or whatever it was was really just an animal. One of the stories he had managed to sneak was that one of an old lady who seemed to be able to travel remarkably quick, especially for somebody with such advanced years, who was often spotted deep in the woods whilst others were hunting, only then to be found on the reserve an impossibly short time later. To our young minds, that didn't seem particularly scary, more wondrous. She was just a little old lady, maybe with magical powers of speed. Super granny, right? But the things grandfather wrote down were far more detailed and far more frightening, depicting these people as black witches with evil intent. Not just old ladies who magically appeared in places too quickly, just to mess with others. These stories involved murder and malice, and if true, would be the stuff of nightmares. Even at 11, when I was just beginning to read more horror and stay up later to catch nighttime movies, I still didn't believe. Sure, to a young kid, say 5 or 6, an old lady could be magical. But to an 11-year-old, witches and these powers grandfather wrote about couldn't be real. I thought that for the next 10 years. Until the other day. Funnily enough, it happened back at the family home. I'd moved away a couple of years before, but still visited fairly regularly, and was home for a birthday, actually. Since all of us had moved out, my parents had gotten a dog and wanting some fresh air, and despite it being fairly late in the evening, I'd volunteered to take her for a walk. We headed out into the woods behind the house, where we'd play for hours as kids, and I'd let her run around for a while, all whilst I just enjoyed the clean air. After only a few minutes, I heard her whimpering. My first thought was that she'd maybe stood on a thorn or something. It was dark, but there was still just enough light to see that she was on the floor, shaking and whining, which was odd, since she'll usually pick a fight with anybody, and is fiercely protective. I'd never seen her in this submissive stance before. Then, I saw why. A pair of eyes were glowing through the tree line. It was unnerving to say the least, as the eyes appeared to look human, but were low down like animal level, and I could just about make out the shape of a large dog, more like a wolf. This creature didn't make a noise, didn't bark, growl, nothing. It was stood and watched, and then it seemed to stand up. I don't mean like a dog when it begs. I mean it stood up like a man. My dog yelped, ran over to me, behind my legs, still shaking. I've seen her square up to the other dogs way bigger than her, but she was terrified. I bent down to comfort her, and when I looked again, it was gone. She barked once, running all the way back to the house, not bothering to wait for me, and I could tell you, I was right behind her. My uncle lived alone. He had become something of a recluse after my aunt had passed on. He was the closest thing I ever had to a father figure growing up, but the closeness never became a genuine thing. He loved me, yeah, but only from a distance. It was frustrating. My real dad was just a face in my memories that would come home long enough to argue with my mom, sleep off whatever he had been doing, then was gone and again, for days at a time. So, the bar was really set low when my uncle came along and would play ball with me, or visit me at school during recess. Very simple gestures, but at the time, they meant the world to me. The frustration came when I would want to spend my time with him where he lived. He had a trailer on several acres of land, mostly all untamed. Even the native plants were untouched, and nothing was mowed or manicured. I didn't quite understand why he was so warm, until it came to his living space. The day came when he was sick, and he would not do well if there wasn't somebody there looking after him for 2 or 3 days. I saw my chance and I took it. He didn't want anybody to babysit him, but it was literally the doctor's orders. I was a teenager by then, but the little boy in me was reeling with delight. He seemed to have mixed feelings about it. He was happy to see me, but there was an uneasiness that I could not source. He wasn't weird or hiding any dark secrets. So, what was this big deal about having me over? I was completely lost in the experience of being out in this amazing untamed wilderness in a home with a father that I never had. It was like another world. I was soon to find out that other worlds have things that are good and bad. However, he was nice until I tried to talk about my aunt. He didn't want to talk about her in any detail whatsoever. Even if I did something as benign as ask if a certain lamp or other item had all been picked out by her, he would answer abruptly, changing the subject. Night came, and he told me that it was very important that I stay inside. I asked him why, but he struggled with giving me a coherent answer. I wasn't sure if maybe it was the heavy medication, the illness, or something else. Surely, it wasn't any terrible secret. If he was a murderer, I wouldn't be hiding inside from anyone he killed, right? When he was asleep, I stepped outside. I wasn't going to be able to see the night sky like that back in the city. Plus, I wanted some fresh air as I thought about how I could bond with my uncle. More without triggering him, of course. That's when I heard it. Above the sounds of insects, owls, and a few wolves, there came a high-pitched squeal that echoed off everything, including the sky. All other sounds vanished, as if all the animal kingdom were afraid. I won't lie, it even made every hair on my body stand on end. I'm usually that dumb kid that wants to run and find out what the strange sound was. But even as I was hesitating, as if I needed any more convincing, I saw movement in the darkness. There was a dim light like a dying candle. I immediately thought that there could have been a trespasser on the property. But if they weren't being sneaky, maybe they needed help. I called out to them. The light source then became 2 red points that now became eyes. I thought that glowing eyes were a cheesy trope left over from 60s horror movies. But this monstrous thing had them. The closest thing I can compare it to is an elk that somehow decided it was going to walk on 2 legs. But the shape was wrong. Instead of hooves, it appeared to have hands, 4 fingers specifically on each, with claws that were curved like a crescent moon. Its mouth hung open, and the only way an elk's mouth could open that wide is if the jaws were unhinged. The teeth and gums were both long, preventing the mouth from closing at all. Ribbons of saliva dripping down into the soil. With each step forward that it took, its pace quickened. Something in my brain kept me from fleeing, though. My uncle was there for one more time. The crack of his rifle made my ears ring as he fired right next to me. The shot knocked this thing backwards and let out this horrendous squeal that was almost as loud as the gunshot itself. He quickly hurried me indoors, and with a single look, I understood why he never had me over. He made some coffee and told me a strange story I'd missed while growing him. He and my aunt had accidentally invited this creature onto their land when they had mistaken it for a stranger that needed help. He told me that something about it was able to come and go as it pleased once it had an invitation. It got my aunt and my uncle, said that it liked to torment him by imitating her voice some nights. It will stand outside his bedroom window and call his name with her voice. If I hadn't seen this creature, I would have claimed he was nuts. This monster was a predator. Surely, it would enjoy ripping the trailer open like a tin can, eating him alive. I mentioned this. He shook his head. He said that it would only delay killing him as long as possible. If he's gone, then it wouldn't have anybody to torment. My story reads like the plot to a bad movie. I guess that goes to show you just how objective and void of poetry tragedy really is. I worked my butt off during my teen years and my early 20s so that I would finally be able to start a family wherever I wanted. I didn't believe in luck. I believed in the grind. By the time I had the financial freedom I wanted, I was 32 and had 3 kids. I had money coming out of my ears, but never splurged. I still looked for the best bargain on a home. I even got an amazing deal on an estate, included a mansion surrounded by a whopping 12 acres of thick timber. It was called Vanishing Point. It's a classic storyline, too good to be true. But I was used to being 100% in control of my own world, so I didn't heed to any such warnings. I never once questioned where the estate's name came from. It was the last property at the furthest point from the township, all while still being within the city proper. So hey, I figured the land was just situated at a literal vanishing point from the perspective of being in the city still. We lived there long enough to have a 4th child before anything else began happening. My 2 oldest boys would go hunting with their pellet rifles. I was trying to be a good dad that didn't hold on too tight, you know? What's all that timber if you're not allowed to explore as a kid? I wanted them to have a rich, full childhood. They left with their guns, and if they didn't come home, those guns would be the only thing that the police would ever find, other than their clothes torn to rags. There was no blood, which made my mind race even more. If they weren't dead, what was being done with them? More years passed, and I got into the habit of taking my last remaining son and our daughter out hunting. I would have let them decide whether they were going to grow up like the hunt. But after the incident, I wanted them to know how to use a gun. I wanted them to know how to shoot another living thing. As if getting out from under the shadow of being a suspect hadn't been hard enough. We had another incident. It was on a hunt with me and the 2 kids. We were somewhere where we were at equal distance from our home and the edge of the estate. In other words, far away from anywhere. It was at a place where the timber was so thick that the sun was nearly blotted out. It was magical. Otherworldly, actually. Some piping, wheezing sound filled the woods. It made things seem a lot darker than they really were. I could feel the blood in my veins go cold. The look on my daughter's face announced she was feeling similar. I looked around for my son to see what his expression was, but nowhere to be found. I called out to him. I ran those woods until my legs could not move. He had disappeared right under my nose. That's when I started becoming that parent. After more drama with the police and the rigors of heartache and grief all over again, I flat out refused to leave my daughter and my wife out of my sight. The only exception being that my wife needed to work outside the home. So I downsized and moved all of my business affairs into our home so I could watch my family full time. My wife disappeared one night on her way home when the car quit as she was on our property. Somewhere between the dead car and our house, she had totally disappeared. But not without a trace. I had trail cams set up at very strategic points. The police could corroborate my evidence that I had not hurt anybody, but they weren't ready to buy into what the cameras were showing them. In a series of blurred snapshots, the cameras pieced together the image of a bipedal abomination with the head of an elk, the teeth and the tail of a wolf, and claws like a bear. The sheer size of this thing was part of what ruled me out as a suspect. Police weren't going to go down that rabbit hole that had just opened up. I knew what it was. This was some sort of shapeshifter, a skinwalker if you will, a witch that has full control to shapeshift through dark magic. wearing the pelts of whatever animal he or she wants to change into. The magic augments the strength of this witch, so much so that it is stronger than either a normal man or animal. Not surprisingly, wearing pelts of more than one animal supposedly lets the witch change into a mixed-up abomination. I paid out no small money of mine asking how you kill such thing. And believe me, the people that know are few and far between, let alone willing to discuss the matter. They're afraid of jade knives. That was my first purchase. I spent more money than I should have having it custom crafted. Second, I would need special bullets. Third, I would need the very thing I didn't believe in. Luck. All the lips that would loosen up and tell me how to kill a skinwalker would tell me that they are so fast and supernatural. They might even be able to outrun mortal weapons, like bullets in certain forms, and at certain levels of magical skill. I didn't care what kind of fairy or wand-waving magician this was, especially after it took my daughter away from me. It had cut my family down to a member of one, and it was dragging out my misery and grief. So, I spent that time wisely, finding the places that had been stashing pelts and magical charms, or so I thought. There was no point in using the police. They already thought I was nuts, and confiscated everything. It's literally down to me, and I'm gonna go after it, as long as it lets me live. I don't care if you believe my story, I really don't. But I feel like there has to be somebody out there who would hear this, and accept that what I'm going through is truth. Maybe somebody could reach out to me and help me kill this thing once and for all. But I don't know anybody brave enough for that. I'm going to need help. We had an encounter 2 years ago on the edge of a small town here in Arizona. I was coming home from work one night and saw something shaped like a large man, only very large, standing in the shadows across my driveway. But it looked disgusting, like I could see bits of flesh and bone, even. It didn't look right. At first, I thought it was just a large somebody who had lost their way, but as I drove closer, even though there were streetlights, I could see this was no man. So I pulled up to my house, and as soon as I stopped the car, this thing got very active, jumping around, low onto its knees and then standing again, like it was trying to intimidate. You could tell by its motions that it was not just another person trying to walk through the grass. This was something that had no use for us and wanted to do the opposite of what you'd expect. I'm sure if I had stayed out another couple of seconds, this thing would have charged me. But as soon as I saw it stirring like this, I drove in. Like many people who see these things, they're not afraid nor will run, but some want to fight them off. I cannot say that I would have done anything different in this situation, except for one thing. Huge mistake. Turns out, if they do run after you, catch you, it just takes one swipe of their hand, and you're gone. For the last 2 years, me and my family have now been looking over our shoulders, scared to death of what can happen if we see one again. I haven't really had another sighting like this since that night. But some nights, I swear, I can hear howling in the distance. I believe I have heard them near the river as well in my small town. If you listen closely when there is no wind on a clear night, you can catch something not quite right in the early morning hours. It feels like it could take practice, but if you listen very closely to the sounds of nature at those times, like crickets and stuff, you will hear it back up in pitch, like it's grading on an upward scale, higher than birds or insects can ever go. And sometimes the insects will go completely silent. That's when you know something isn't quite right. The atmosphere changes. I always feel like I'm being watched when I hear this. I'm not too scared to leave the house. but I do check the back mirror constantly when driving, always looking over my shoulder, especially at night. I have a 5-year-old son who has seen him as well. He was only around 4 years old at the time. He told me that it was scary, that he didn't want to be playing outside anymore because the monster is out there. The most shocking part of all of this is that one time, when we were a couple miles into town, we branched off from one of the streets to the other to a family's house. Now over here, there's this alleyway between a few houses where nobody ever seems to go. This thing was making noise down there. Whatever it was doing, it was waking people up very early in the morning. I think nobody would come out of their houses for hours after that. They were afraid this thing was around. It does things like startles you by being very active and moves out of sight before being seen or heard from again. I guess sometimes my family's neighbors have talked about seeing a large black shape running off into the woods at night. Nobody really knows who or what it is. Hey, I was reading your stories, and I wanted to share this one. It happened when I was a kid in front of an old schoolhouse. The place had been abandoned for quite some time, and my friends and I were out playing that day. We saw something moving around inside the building, so we decided to wait until it came out again. A few minutes later, something moved in front of the window. Just when we thought it had come out, it quickly went behind the building, and we lost sight of whatever it was. It came around again, and this time I got a clear look at what appeared to be some sort of wolf or dog, but with wide shoulders, much like a football player would have. It actually appeared to look more like a large upright coyote than anything else. It was freaky looking. At one point, we actually thought it had spotted us and began coming toward us. We nearly wet ourselves before it went back behind the schoolhouse again. From what we could see briefly, the creature was dark all over with a long snout, wide shoulders. It kind of reminded me of an ape, but very different looking. Its hair was almost falling out. It was very scary. We never talked about it with our parents, but as we got older, we would sometimes bring it up. Knowing all the things I do now, I really do wonder if it was a skinwalker. I had another friend growing up who actually just very recently shared with me his experience, which he granted me full permission to share with you. The similarities between what he saw and I did are striking. Here's his story. I was about 12 years old, and I had just gotten home after walking back from a friend's house. My friend lived next to an open lot with several trees in it. It also had a small creek that ran along one side of the property border, going into a big river that cut through the center of town. To be honest, I never felt comfortable there, going by myself. You could often hear strange noises coming from over there at night, and it gave me the creeps. Plus, I'm pretty sure I've seen some pretty sketchy homeless people. Can't be too safe. Anyway, I was walking to my house and passed by that open lot when I noticed a figure moving between some trees. It moved quickly from one to another, as if it were pacing back and forth. Just then, my dog gets spooked and starts howling at the top of his lungs, trying to jump out of my arms. He somehow slips from my tight grip, takes off running down the street in a panic, away from whatever the figure was. I start yelling at him to come back, but he wouldn't listen. The next thing I know is that something starts moving toward me between two trees. It's headed right for me. I froze, and before I could even think about turning around to run, I saw it. In the darkness between those two trees, I caught a glimpse of an upright animal-like figure with long black hair, golden, staring eyes. It was like looking into death, honestly. It reminded me of a dead, rotting coyote. Gross. You could visibly see flesh missing from its face and head, and the stench was horrendous. I didn't waste a second. I turned and ran as fast as I could away from the thing, without ever looking back. This thing, though, moved incredibly swiftly for whatever it was. I luckily escaped. A few days after, I'd asked my neighbor about it. She said that the same thing had happened to her a few months earlier. She described it as the same thing that I had seen. I don't know what they are, but now I'm curious to find out if there were any other incidents like what I saw that night. Maybe there are more stories out there. The incident that happened to my friend is very real and similar to the one I had as a kid. It really makes me wonder what sort of horrible creature I witnessed that day. We were in the area of Ridgway in Colorado during the winter months. It was 2 days before Christmas when I stopped at a small gas station. I had forgot to get my dad a Christmas present, so I was hoping to score him a neat little novelty gift from Colorado. When I was done, I decided that I wanted to go home the long way, instead of taking the highway back up north where I live. I went towards that direction and got on 90 to head back. There's a small town called Crawford, not too far from there, I believe. The road takes you through this little valley, which has nothing on either side of it, but ranges at high elevation and hills all around. Not to mention mountain-type hills, just like big, small rolling hills. My friend was in the passenger seat. We're talking about random stuff, when she happened to look out the back window. She said she saw something in the rearview mirror. She sees behind the car and says, "What's that?" I look over my shoulder to see this big black dog running alongside the car that has made its way from behind the vehicle. I slow down, and so does this thing. So I speed up, and it speeds up. Now we're thinking, is this a lost dog or something? But then I get a better view as it stands up on two legs and violently tries ripping the door off our vehicle. I speed up again, and it jumps down. But I don't think we got away that easily. The look on this thing was demonic. Red eyes and a black muzzle, kind of like a horse's face, very elongated, more so than any other regular dog. This was like an animal from hell. It didn't just have black skin. The fur was black, but the parts of skin appeared to be grayish. We were both shocked, didn't know what to do really, so we just kept driving, looking out the back window to see if it was still behind us. It wasn't until later when my friend's mom called her that my friend was so freaked out and told her mom what had chased us. My mom's friend just says, "You guys have to be drunk or on drugs." I told her we weren't. Was this a skinwalker? I've never seen anything like that in my life, and was too scared to go back up there. I'm hoping it wasn't a skinwalker or anything. I've heard that they mark people. I've always been open to things and never thought much about spirits or demons. But after all of this has happened, I'm now just too scared to go back up there. Also, my friend's aunt is Native American, Lakota and Sioux. She said that maybe it was some kind of spirit, but of course my friend's mom is the total opposite of her sister. Firm atheist, doesn't believe in any of it. Anyway, the way it looked at us, everything, it still haunts me. It's like it was angry we were in that part of the road. I don't even recall where it came from. Since then, I have been obsessively looking up information on skinwalkers, and they're supposed to be these supernatural beings who can take any form of any kind of animal. Help me as I search for answers. This was back in the 1960s, when I worked for the U.S. Forest Service, doing fire protection work in areas covering an enormous amount of land in 3 adjoining counties. At the time, these had the highest number of forest fires per year than any part of the country at the time. If this happened today, they would have been called wildfires for sure. and it would probably be a terrorist act against our forest by some crazed lunatic who hates trees. Okay, maybe that's being a little overdramatic, but I think you get the idea. One day, when I was about 20 years old, I went out on patrol duty up one side of a mountain and down the other, keeping a check on some crews that were building fire breaks. It was hot and dry like it normally is in northern Arizona, out here in July and August when wildfire season is at its peak. I had just finished my lunch, and I heard a loud howling coming up from behind me, where there was a cliff about 40 feet up, with a rock slide at its base. This was way back before they built any picnic areas, or even paved roads up there. Nobody else knew it was there. There hadn't been any elk herd around for several years due to overhunting at this point, by everybody who wanted deer, just due to the severe lack of rain we had been experiencing. Since this encounter happened almost 50 years ago now, I can't remember what time of the day it was exactly, but at first, I thought it might be some kids from Flagstaff, maybe having a good time, playing games and romancing one another in the wilderness they had found up there. But when I heard this loud howling during this dry season, without any elk around to attract them, it just didn't seem right. So I took my .38 caliber revolver out of its holster, began walking toward where these strange sounds seemed to be coming from, as fast as I could. The unusual thing about this sound is that it did not seem like any animal sound. Rather, it appeared more human. As soon as I got there, my worst fear was confirmed. A full-grown man wearing animal skins was standing on top of that rock slide. The only ones wearing animal skins at the time that I was aware of were the Navajo, who lived in the area to the north near Lava Shell Dam, 15 miles away from this location. There were no Navajos working for the U.S. Forest Service back then or living anywhere near this mountain. I slowly walked away from him when he began making grunting noises and angry growling sounds like a bear would do when it's trying to intimidate somebody defending its territory. He quickly seemed to disappear from the cliff, and I was not going to stick around after that. Later on, I got in my Jeep and drove off to Flagstaff, where I told a friend about what had happened. He knew all about these guys because they had been terrorizing the locals, killing cattle, or just mutilating them by taking out their organs and taking off their flesh. The Navajos, from what I was aware, called them Skinwalkers. Others would call them Shapeshifters, but they're just human beings who can change into animals and kill to satisfy their unquenchable bloodlust. When we went back up there with the sheriff's deputy from the county, we found some of the remains of an animal that had been half-eaten. It was lying on top of a rock slide with its head and neck completely removed from the rest of its body. That's all I'll share for now, but I've had so many disturbing experiences back in the day, it's not funny, and I've learned a lot. Maybe I'll sit down and share with you more from an old ranger like me. Thanks for reading. A group of us were out by the reservoir here in Southern California. There is a story about this certain area. The rumor goes that, I guess there was an Indian res, and they destroyed it to build a dam or something, or took over their land, something like that. But some of them refused to ever leave. My grandfather told me he saw one years ago when he was just a little kid running around at night, being dared by his friends. But he didn't really believe it was true. After we had settled down for the night, there were coyotes howling. Then all of a sudden, more dogs joined in on the chorus. So my buddy Mike decided, hey, let's go see if we can see them. So we walk about 150 yards from our campsite, closer to the reservoir, and we're watching them. Mike sees a coyote turn around and look at us, then proceeds to stand fully erect on two legs. It looked straight at us, sprinting to the nearest tree and climbed right up, disappearing. We had heard the stories before about skinwalkers, but this time, I was convinced that they were there. We went back to camp and told our friends about what we saw next. Then, everybody's convinced there are skinwalkers around us. This one skinwalker must have been trying to blend in with the others. I'm not too sure how that works. We all slept with a gun right beside our pillows that night. The next morning, we had been awoken to the sounds of dogs howling again, except this time, they were much closer. I looked over at my friend Patrick, who was, at the time, out by the tent. He sat straight up in his sleeping bag, screaming, his eyes still tightly shut. I had to wake him up. He was having this violent nightmare. He later claimed that these skinwalker beings were trying to infiltrate his mind through nightmares. Take it what you will, but this was by far the most terrifying camping trip I've ever been on, and the closest I'd ever been to seeing and dealing with an actual skinwalker creature. Something I always thought was a myth and legend. Not anymore. My encounter with a skinwalker was almost 8 years ago now. The details can be a little fuzzy now and then, but I'll do my best to give you a rundown. A friend of mine, who's not Native American, and I, Native American, were out in Utah on an excursion. We parked our truck at the end of a pretty empty dirt road and hiked out from there. We were walking for quite some time, a good 2 miles, maybe more. Now, after about 20 minutes of going through the desert, we hear a strange noise behind us. I did not give it much thought at first, but my friend kept glancing back over his shoulder at the sound. Whatever was making these noises couldn't have been too far behind us. They were loud and very distinct sounding. They sounded somewhat like a dog barking, but different. More eerie, I guess you could say. Another few minutes go by and we see something running on all fours, stand up on 2 legs before disappearing again. At first, my mind did not register what it was that I saw, so I looked at my friend to say something. He just turned around and booked it. My arms seemed to move faster than they ever had before, pumping with adrenaline and fear. We made it away from the thing and back to our truck. Later that night, we couldn't stop talking about what kind of being that thing was. We were sure we had encountered a skinwalker. The next day, we drove to a nearby Navajo reservation, asked around. The people there seemed nervous and uncomfortable to talk about it, but some of them told us, yes, they're real, and we had most certainly encountered one. They said if you see this thing, you should run, because the only really way to get away from them is by outrunning them. I don't know if that's true. The gentleman that told us this was very young. So, long story short, I haven't seen or heard any more of these strange happenings since then, but this experience has changed my life forever. It's also important to mention that even though I'm Native, I'm actually adopted. Both my real parents passed away at birth, so I live in Northern California. I really have no connection or education on my Native heritage, so I'm not really connected to my culture. But after this sighting, it's kind of made me re-spark an interest in Native American culture altogether. I'm fairly certain that what I saw that night on the ranch was actually a skinwalker. I know enough about Navajo culture to understand that these are dark beings you should not be messing with, and doing your best to avoid. Here's what briefly happened. I grew up and still live in Arizona on a cattle ranch. Well, I stay there periodically. I don't really live there anymore. We've got the stereotypical cactus-covered hills, mountain ranges, hot summers, you get it. A few years ago, we had some issues with coyotes attacking our calves. Coyotes are not uncommon to have around ranches, but they usually don't hunt down large animals, like the way my calves were being hunted. I know, calves aren't large, but they're pretty protected. At least these were. They'd sneak up on them and just tear into them, leaving ravaged carcasses behind that my father and I would find while checking on the stock. It was pretty gruesome what they were doing to our livestock. So my dad had called me one night after talking to a friend about his and about how best to get rid of these guys, when he came across a story about skinwalkers. I mean, you're talking about folk magic, straight out of a horror movie here. The kind where there are witches that transform into coyotes. Anyway, he told me to buy some special ribbon, red I believe, and tie it all around the cattle pens at night, so that way what he believed were skinwalkers would not attack our livestock anymore. Of course, being young and naive, I was just brash. I just explained to him, "Dad, these aren't skinwalkers. These are just regular coyotes." But he told me a story of one night he saw a couple of these things changing into men. I'm not so sure I believed him, but I did what he asked. I brought him the ribbon. I guess my father also shot at one of these things, and the entire group of these coyotes all stood up on two legs and ran off, the same way a man would, even at this speed. He firmly believes that these things were indeed a pack of hungry skinwalkers. Safe to say, I believe that ranch is cursed now, if not anything, especially after shooting at it.